part. I'm just asking kasi it
Well, just
appears that there's another list of projects na pinibigyan niyo ng savings aside from that because COMELEC is not here.
Alimbawa ho, nung nag-submit kami ng yung unang DAP.
Hindi, yun na nga. Bakit wala ho yung COMELEC dito?
Yung unang DAP, October 12, 2011. Yung request nila was sometime August eh. Doon pa, wala pa ho yung, hindi pa ho naiisip yung DAP.
Saan nga ho nakalista yung DAP?
Yung COMELEC ho, hindi pa siya saklaw.
Yung COMELEC ni-request sa inyo nung anong...
Bandang August, kung di ako nagkakamali, of 20...
I have year of back. Sige, let's talk about...
2012 pala, August 2012.
May DAP na muna, di ba? So,
kaya lang ho, yung memo, yung package ng DAP projects na sinubmit for approval by the President, hindi ho nakasama yung requirement.
So ano pa ho mga proyekto na katulad ng COMELEC na hindi kasama sa DAP pero nabigyan ng pera through savings?
We can submit that ho.
Mr. Chair, kailan niyo ho pwedeng isubmit yun?
Well,
Naging mas magana ang tanghalian kasama ang Balitang Hali at Jolly Spaghetti.
are exclusively for DAP. Kaya lang yung DAP, they enjoy preference kasi mabilis aksyonan ng presidente.
Bakit nasama ho sa listahan sa Supreme Court yung COMELEC kung hindi to parte ng DAP?
Because yung issue ho nung cross-border.
So, ang lumalabas, so you offer that project pagdating ho dun sa cross-border issue. Di ba ang issue dito yung DAP? Hindi naman yung...
Ang issue ho yung principle na separation of powers and checks and balances. So, pumasok ho yung issue ng...
Just to clarify, the document Senator Binay is asking for, yung 237 billion, ito yung savings na pinul for DAP purposes.
Hindi, that's the total saving that's available for use by the government.
Total savings yon.
Oh.
Ang DAP is 167 billion yung may propose, 144 yung nirelease.
Na-release, tama ho yan.
So ang sinasabi nyo, kung wala sa listahan na sinubmit nyo ang COMELEC, kasama yon sa balanse ng 237 minus 167.
Tama ho yan.
And ano po ang tawag nyo dun sa programang yon, kung meron mang pangalan, na gumagamit kayo ng savings na hindi under DAP na napupunta, halimbawa, sabi nyo nga sa COMELEC?
Well, yun ho yung halimbawa ho, kasi yung kinukuha namin savings from unobligated allotments or unreleased appropriations, yun ho yung talagang core nung savings na ginagamit sa DAP. Pero meron kasi mga ibang pinanggagalingan ng savings katulad ng MPBF na hindi nagagamit na, yun ang parang regular savings eh. Na
so hindi DAP yun?
Hindi DAP yun.
Ano po ang tawag doon?
Well, regular savings lang ng gobyerno yun. Halimbawa, yung COMELEC kasi, talagang very urgent yung siguro kung nasama lang siya doon sa yung pagbuo ng memo to the President. Kasi mahirap din magpapirma sa ating Pangulo. You have to put together a list of projects kasi hindi naman natin pwedeng sabihin na isa-isahin nating ilapit sa Pangulo. And this one was particularly urgent kasi ang pangamba nga ni Chairman Brillantes, baka hindi matuloy yung election.
I agree, Secretary Van, but what distinguishes it from DAP? Meaning, sino magsasabi kung DAP siya o hindi? When it's DAP, the President has to sign it because it's realigning savings. Even if it's non-DAP, but it's still the utilization of savings to
The President still approves it.
The President still approves it. So,
yes.
Who gets to say that
Well,
it's DAP and non-DAP?
Yung mga nasa DAP enjoy preference over the regular use of savings.
But this should have enjoyed preference too because wala tayong election pag hindi napuntahan.
Yeah, pero hindi ho siya nasama dun sa batch na yon that was sought for approval by the President.
Under DAP?
Pero it would have very well qualified under it. Kaya lang isa lang ho siyang isinubmit.
Mag-isa. At hindi nasabi...
Kasi urgent at biglang kinailangan because of the decision to procure the PCOS machines.
Actually, the confusion, I think, Secretary Abad, lies in the fact that whether it's lumped with other projects or individually, DAP is DAP. I mean, di ba? I mean, hindi lang ho ba nalagay sa sulat na DAP to? But it would have been DAP. I mean, it would qualify.
Well, DAP kasi, that's why it's confusing because DAP is not source of funds.
I know.
DAP is a package of reforms, for example, to plug leakages, to eliminate wastages, to untangle bottlenecks, and to accelerate project implementation. So, kung iisipin lang natin na DAP is just simply a source of funding, magiging malilito ho kayo because DAP is more than that.
I understand. It's a program. And as you said, this would very well have fall under that program.
Kailangan when we submitted the batches of projects under DAP for approval by the President, eto ho, malamang hindi ho siya
Hindi
nakasama.
nasama. And this has no name.
Wala. Use of regular savings.
Thank you.
Mr. Chairman,
Senator Marcos.
with the indulgence of Senator Binay, I think just to clarify this issue, alam naman natin at nababanggit na rin, ngunit hindi buo napapag-usapan. In any analysis of expenditures, what we usually look for in any entity are the sources and uses of funds. So sa uses, mukhang meron na tayo between what you have given to the Supreme Court in the evidence packet at saka dito sa binigay niyo sa amin ngayon sa uses. Ngayon, ang kulang na informasyon sa amin ngayon ang yung sources. Kaya kung maaari, maibigay sa komite ang sources ng mga pondo na pinagpondohan, na nagpondo sa DAP, sa the Disbursement Acceleration Program. What are the monies, where did they come, how much they were, where they came from, on a yearly basis, how and why were they declared savings para maging available for use under the program that is DAP. So if we could have that is as complete as complete a listing as you can give us, sana yearly, starting 2000, kasi 2010 ang unang savings yata na ginamit ng DAP. Is that correct?
Some parts of
some
2010.
portion. So, kung ano yung sa 2010 na nag-savings, saan nanggaling, anong ahensya, anong departamento, at kung kailan na-deklara na savings yun, at bakit na-deklara ng savings yung pondong yun. That will clarify many of the questions that the senators have.
We will do that, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. Thank you,
Secretary
Mr.
Abad
Chairman.
is so directed with understanding, Senator Marcos, as I understand, Secretary Abad, money is fungible. So if you pool the savings from the various agencies at galing sa pooled savings na yun may nilagay ka sa isang ahensya, you can no longer point out na itong particular amount na ito ay nanggaling sa particular agency. Would that be correct?
Yes, wala ho tayong pwedeng ibigay na one-to-one correspondence. Kasi but we can show you
Where it came from.
Where it came from. Where it
Now,
came from.
our
Sa sources
only-
and uses naman, hindi naman 1:1 yun.
But so for as long as it's taken in that sense, sir.
Hindi. Wala naman sources and uses na makikita mo na very direct na
Yes.
dito
Yes.
nang galing din pumunta. Ang kailangan lang natin, dahil naibigay, marami na kayo naibigay between nga yung evidence packet ninyo sa Supreme Court at saka itong binigay ninyo sa amin today. Pero yung sa sources side, wala kaming masyadong impormasyon. Kaya kung ano yung pera na naging savings na ginamit ng programang DAP, saan nanggaling, kailan naging savings at bakit naging savings. That will clarify so many
Yes.
of our questions.
Yeah, with the clarification that we're not looking at a one-to-one
It's not a one-to-one.
correspondence.
Maybe the bottom line.
Yeah.
The bottom line will match, but not
We can do that,
not
Mr.
the
Chairman.
items. Okay, thank you.
Ang lalabas
Thank
sa
you,
bottom line, Bale Secretary, Senator Marcos, would be, ito ang total savings ng COA, ito yung nabigay sa COA. Is it in excess or below the savings that they have? At the end of the day, ito naman mag-matter eh. If it's cross-border or not.
Precisely. But even if it is not a corresponding expenditure in COA, kung yun ang naging savings ng COA, just to use COA as an example, kung kahit hindi napunta lahat yung savings sa COA, kung ano man ang naging source ng pondong nagamit ng
Yes.
DAP, wherever, what agency it came from, what year, and the reason that it was declared a savings.
Yes.
We can do that. Mr.
I think, I'm sure you have that material.
Yes.
The
Yes,
document.
Mr.
And
Chairman.
further, Secretary, but I think because there is cross-border on the expenditure side, there may also be cross-border in the sources of the savings.
Well, in our case, kaya that's why I made the distinction between the previous incarnations of use of savings. Kasi in the previous years, what the past administrations would do is to impound appropriations at the end of the year. Yun. And that was a practice at the start of the year.
At the start of the year.
So meron ho silang galing dun sa ahensya, and then if the fiscal picture would look good, then they would gradually release the appropriations to them.
Kaya Mr. Chairman, mahalaga yung date na kung anong taon na book yung savings na yon. Tapos we will then take those sources. I'm sure Secretary Purisima has that material ready somewhere. Dahil yan ang sources na pinanggagalingan sa Department of Finance. Then we will then look at the sources, and then we will then look at the uses. And with that, we will have a better picture kung paano ba talaga, anong nangyari, saan gumalaw yung pera niyan.
Agree.
Yes.
So directed.
Thank you,
We will do
Mr.
that,
Chairman.
Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Binay, for
Thank you,
your
Senator
patience.
Marcos. Senator Binay, ma'am.
Magkano ho ulit yung nabigay sa COMELEC?
Around 4.1 billion.
And to clarify, ano ho yung dahilan kung bakit sila nabigyan ng 4.1 billion?
Well, ang inaangal ni Chairman Brillantes noon, they needed, might as well,
Ano gusto?
the permission of the chairman.
Dali na, tapos na. Handa. Tapos na.
Nung una silang lumapit ho sa amin, they were requesting for 5.228 billion pesos. And the biggest chunk were yung expenses related to the acquired PCOS machines. So kailangan ng collateral, software support and maintenance, increase in traveling, training, and seminar expenses. Then they also had warehousing and configuration facilities for PCOS machines. And then synchronization of national and local election. I guess this is, a lot of it is software licenses. And then yung additional requirements for overseas absentee voting, SK and barangay registration, and SK barangay elections. But in the negotiations with the COMELEC, eventually we settled down to recommending to the President the release of 4.14 billion, Mr. Chairman.
Mga anong month ho yung negotiations nyo with COMELEC?
Well, yung memorandum namin sa Presidente was dated November 22 for the release of 4.1 billion. But the first letter of the Secretary to us, I think came
Secretary ho or Commissioner
si
Brillantes?
Chairman. Started in July. Si Chairman started in July.
What year po?
2012 ho.
At ano nakasulat sa request? What amount?
They were asking for reconsideration because they wanted 18.2 billion pesos. And we were saying that they could do with 8.4 billion. So they wrote to appeal. And that was the first. And subsequently also wrote in August, the chairman.
So, sinabihan na ho kayo ng COMELEC na kailangan nila ay 12 billion. Tama po ba?
18.
18 billion, tapos how much was approved?
Well, eventually it was 8 billion, 8.4 billion.
But you already knew that they needed 18 billion, am I correct?
Well, katulad ho nung sinasabi ninyo with respect to COA, sinasabi namin sa kanila, meron ho kayong savings but hindi ninyo gamitin yung savings.
Pero kanina ho, sinabi nyo, kulang ang savings sila, di ba?
Well,
That's why there was a need for you to augment the budget of
when they
COMELEC.
decided to buy the PICOS machines, I think ito yata.
Pero ho, yung PICOS machines, ang deed of sale with Smartmatic was March 2012. Binigyan niyo ho sila ng SARO, December na. So, hindi na ho issue yung PICOS kasi binili na ho ng COMELEC yung PICOS Marso pa lang eh.
Ang issue kasi noon na pinagtatalunan na walang malinaw desisyon, kung uupahan o bibilhin yung mga PICOS machine. Kaya nagbabago-bago ho yung figures kasi kung uupahan lang naman, the cost of warehousing will not be the obligation of the COMELEC. So, depende ho on what mode was going to be adopted, whether they were going to lease it or buy it, magbabago ho yung kanilang costing.
Hindi, pero na-inform na ho kayo ng COMELEC na ganito yung kailangan nila for 2013 election. But in spite of that request, hindi ho sila binigyan ng pondo. Kaya ho napilitan kayong maglabas ng 4 billion noong December kasi ang ingay na ho ni Chairman Brillantes na pag hindi kami nabigyan ng ganitong pondo, hindi matutuloy or magre-revert tayo sa mano. When you could have prevented this already kung binigyan nyo na ng budget ang COMELEC ng 4 billion. Kahit hindi na nga 5 billion eh. Pero hindi nyo ho ni-recommend sa Kongreso. Ang ni-recommend nyo ho sa Kongreso na budget ng COMELEC was, if I'm correct, 7 billion. Tama po ba? But during, I think, their budget
fiscal year 2012,
for
7 billion.
2013 po.
Kasi marami ho dun sa gagawin ng COMELEC, hindi ho mangyayari sa 2012, sa 2013 at mangyayari sa 2012.
Ayun na nga ho bakit hindi, they already asked for that amount. Kasi alam niyo, di ba, kaya nga may provision din sa Constitution natin na parang may fiscal independence. The mere fact na parang na-hijack yung, kailangan magmakaawa ni Chairman Brillantes para mabigyan sila ng 4 billion sa inyo, or else kung hindi pa ho nag-ingay si Chairman, hindi ho ata mabibigay itong pondo na to. And I don't know kung anong naging epekto neto noong 2013 election.
Mr. Chairman, just a point of intervention. Fiscal independence doesn't mean that whatever the budget submitted by the agencies will be approved. That is not fiscal independence. Because certainly, when the budget is prepared, the Congress, the executive, have the right to look at the details of the budget. So it doesn't mean that if COMELEC submitted this budget, it cannot be reduced because of fiscal independence. It can be reviewed. Just that point, Mr. Chairman.
What really complicated the negotiations, because we negotiate with every agency. In fact, to be honest with you, we have difficulty negotiating with constitutionally, fiscally autonomous agencies because every time we ask them or we inquire into their finances, they always raise the issue of fiscal autonomy. So we cannot get the information that we need to be able to say that you still have money for this and that. And as a result, what we do is sometimes we, looking at our statement of allotments and obligation balances, we try to, in fact, at sometimes second guess the agency because it still had savings. It probably does not need this much money. So that is the other problem with the agencies like this. And you, as Congress, might want to look into this situation because that was the complication really here was a decision whether to buy or to lease. By the time there was a decision to buy the computers, the budget had already been put together. So it could no longer be accommodated in the budget.
Nabili ho nila yung machine March 2012. Di ba nagsasubmit kayo ng budget July pa, after the SONA of the President?
All the initial submissions of COMELEC were proposals to lease the equipment, not to buy. So yun ho yung naging issue.
But meron hong dokumento sa COMELEC that they purchased the machines June 13, 2012.
That may be correct, but when they submitted their request to us, it was on the basis of the fact that they were going to lease the equipments.
Ang ano lang ho kasi dito sa COMELEC, I think they asked for a 22 billion budget at the beginning, am I correct?
Yeah, and
then-
you can very well see why at
Malaki.
DBM, being public expenditure managers, we do not take this
Yes.
request simply on their face value.
And then ho, you sent them a letter saying na 12 billion na lang yung budget nila, am I correct?
Which letter are
May,
you
May
referring to?
2012. Tama po ba?
That's a confirmation letter of
Na-
the budget that was going
Na
to
12
them.
billion na lang ho.
Ah.
Tapos naghumingi ho ng risk consideration ng COMELEC kung pwede gawing 17 billion. Tama po ba?
Masaya ho yung aming negosasyon with COMELEC because, as you correctly pointed out, in 2012, they had an allocation of 7 billion pesos for the PCOS machines.
Nagkaroon ho ba kayo ng
But-
negotiation sa Malacanang?
Ah,
Nagkaroon ho ba kayo ng negotiation sa Malacanang?
well, they come to the DBM, they bring their budget officers.
But not hindi ho sa loob ng Malacanang.
Hindi, sa DBM.
Sa office niyo lang.
Because pupunta talaga yung mga ahensya sa amin to negotiate for their budget.
Sige ho. So, di ba, from 17
Yan.
billion,
So, when
they asked for 17 billion.
they bought the PCOS machines at 1.8 billion. So, if you were going to do the math, dapat meron pa silang savings na 5 billion. And that's why we insisted na why don't you use your 5 billion if you have additional requirements now that you have decided to buy the machines.
Kaya ho, humingi ho sila ng reconsideration.
By the way, this was sometime in November or December already.
June ho.
Hindi, itong 5 billion, when we release it.
No, the letter said was June.
Yeah. No, I'm saying the release made
No, I'm
was
talking
sometime.
about yung ano niya yung exchange of correspondence niya
Yeah,
with COMELEC.
and,
Di ba from 17, sinabihan niyo na nga sila, sige, bibigyan namin kayong 12 billion, sumulat sila. Sabi niya, baka pwede 17 billion. Ang ginawa niyo ho, binawasan niyo palalo, ginawa niyo 7 billion. Tama po ba?
Yes, because, the problem is they never showed to us their financial reports on how they spent their money. And our dilemma is, sabi nga namin, you have been given an allocation of 7 billion for PCOS machines in 2012. When you bought it, the machines only cost you 1.8 billion. So you would have had a savings of 5 billion.
Pero sinasabi niyo ho, kaya niyo sila binigyan ng 4 billion kasi bibili nila yung PCOS machine.
Well-
Pero sinasabi niyo ho ngayon, nabili na nila yung PCOS machine.
When they decided to buy it, ngayon, when they came back to us, ang ina-argue nila, but that is only the cost of the machine. We have to store the machines, we have to continue to train, we have to maintain the machine. So, ang dami ho nilang idinagdag na hanggat sa punto, sinasabi, kailangan pa namin ng additional 5 billion pesos.
Eh, bakit hindi na
5.2.
lang ho kayo nag-stick dun sa 12 billion para hindi nyo kailangan magkaroon ng ganitong nagkakaroon tuloy tayo ng issue dito sa cross-border kasi nagbigay kayo ng 4 billion sa COMELEC noong December 2013.
Trabaho ho namin tiyakin na
So,
yung pera na ibibigay ay sapat na pera talaga na kailangan nila. Kasi alam namin na merong savings eh. Hindi lang sinasabi sa amin, saan yung pagagamitin yung savings?
So,
Tapos, habang hindi naayos yun, nandun sila sa media at sinasabi, hindi matutuloy yung eleksyon.
Pero I guess, lumalabas nga ako, hindi kayo naniwala. So parang it was poor budgeting on your part. Kasi ito na nga yung agency na nagsasabi na we need more than 7 billion. Tapos at the end of the day, binigyan nyo din naman pala sila ng pera. Tapos ngayon nagkakaroon pa tayo ng question
can you imagine,
kung saan...
they were asking for 7, we gave 4. So,
No, they were asking for 12. You gave them...
exactly.
no, you gave them 12. They asked for 17. Tapos you gave them 7. Tapos at the end of the day, binigyan nyo din sila ng 4. So parang bumalik din tayo dun sa 12. Eh bakit hindi
but
nyo
can
na
you
lang...
imagine they started with 22?
Hindi, pero...
Diba? I mean,
pero ang pinayagan nyo na was 12 eh. Bakit hindi na lang tayo bumalik dun sa 12?
Kaya kung if they were really transparent with their... It's not so much poor budgeting.
So kasalanan ho ng COMELEC.
If they are transparent and accountable for all the funds that they use and present to us in detail, as you are asking us to do, to submit detailed reports, I don't think that we will have that problem. And that is the same way for other agencies that are categorized as constitutionally, because they think that being fiscally autonomous means that you have nothing to do with us. No, I don't think that that is the case. Being fiscally autonomous doesn't exempt agencies from the requirements of transparency and accountability.
Hindi, parang nakakatakot po kasi Secretary Abad. Nagiging discretion nyo ngayon kung kailan nyo sila bibigyan at hindi. I think that's my last point. Siguro, just to reiterate, Mr. Chair, yung mga nire-request ko na listahan, lalong-lalo na lumabas dito sa pondo na nakuha ng COMELEC is not from DAP. So I think we need to get another list kung ano-ano pa yung mga proyekto na kinuha sa savings pero hindi parte ng DAP. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. As previously directed, I think the Secretary is already committed to comply. Moving forward, Chair now recognizes Senator Angara.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Magandang hapon po sa ating mga kasamahan at ginagalang na kinatawan led by Secretary Butchavad. Hindi ko na po tatagalan yung pagtanong ko dahil alam kong malamang gutom na po yung ating mga resource persons. But, Mr. Chairman, Secretary Abad, naniniwala ho ba kayo na mahalaga yung tiwala ng taong bayan para sa operasyon ng isang pamahalaan?
Napakahalaga po, Mr. Chairman.
Opo. Sinabi ko po yon dahil may mga lumabas na survey etong mga nakaraang linggo at hindi lang yung rating po ng ehekutibo, pati ang rating po ng lehislatibo, parehong kamara ay bagsak ho. So, sa akin, tingin ko parang may konting loss of confidence on the part of the public. So ang iniisip ko, ano ho ba yung confidence building or trust building measures na pwede nating ihain going forward, especially dito sa ating budgeting process. Dahil ang reklamo nga ng ating taong bayan, parang ang pakiramdam nila wala silang taya, wala silang partisipasyon dito sa ating budgeting process. In many ways, as someone who has served in government for the last decade, I feel I can feel, nararamdaman ko yung pakiramdam din nila eh. Kasi parang sabi nyo, it's arcane, it's complex, it's complicated. Hindi ho ba pwede na ibuksan ho natin tong paraan natin ng pagbabudget? Not just in the executive and the use of savings, pati na rin ho siguro dito sa lehislatura. The Senate President said that on the part of the Senate, maaring apektado kami dun sa PDAF scandal. Ang nakikita kong common thread ho kasi dito, there are enormous lump sums which is public money. At hindi alam ng taong bayan saan ginagamit yung pera. Parang napakalayo nila sa proseso. So wala ba tayong naisip na reforma going forward? Kasi nailabas na ng ating kasamahan na nagawa yan ng most presidents or all presidents after the EDSA revolution. So ang tanong siguro ng bayan is anong pagbabago sa sistema ang gagawin natin?
Na sumasang-ayon naman kami sa inyo na yung tiwala, lalo na kung ang pag-uusapan yung kaba ng bayan dahil siguro sa karanasan ng mga nakaraang taon, there is a propensity of people to believe that government is corrupt and people in government are corrupt, parang gano'n na nakalulungkot na kalalagayan, pero ganyan talagang hinaharap natin. So, yung mungkahi po ninyo na buksan natin ang proseso ng pagbabudget sa partisipasyon ng taong bayan sa pamamagitan ng kanilang mga samahan. Kaya sa DBMO, meron ho kaming tinatawag na budget partnership agreements. Between, halimbawa, budget ng DNR for a specific program like National Greening Projects, yung mga environmental groups ho, during the process of budget preparation, they get to give inputs to the budget of the Department of Environment and Natural Resources with respect to the National Greening Program. So maraming ganyang pangyari. O di kaya naman, yung budget halimbawa ng Department of Agriculture, particularly sa irrigation, farm-to-market roads at iba pang pangailangan, merong mga grupo na nakikipagpulong sa... In fact, they sign a formal... they sign a formal budget partnership agreement and setting forth the terms and conditions for the engagement. So, bukas ho kami dyan kung mapapalalim, ibig sabihin hindi lang sa isang programa or mapapalawak, hindi lamang sa isang ahensya. Para sa amin, napakaganda hong pangyayari. Dahil...
Take your time ho, sir. Take your time ho. Huwag tayo magmadali.
Dahil po napakahalaga na may balik natin.
May I ask for a 2 minutes
pagpatuloy ng Okay lang. May pagpatuloy yung tiwala ng tao sa proseso.
Maganda yun, no? I take cognizance of yung mga measures na minungkahi, the open budgeting system, the bottom-up budgeting, maganda ho yan. At ako'y tiwala na karamihan dito sa DAP projects nakatulong po sa taong bayan. Pinabasa ko po yung projects sa CHED. I'm happy that the CHED, because I was the chair of the Committee on Higher Education previous, maraming pondo po ang nakuha for scholarships, etc. Pero ano na hong gagawin natin kung hindi na po si Pangulong Aquino ang nakaupo? Diba? As legislators, we must be looking towards the future. At ganitong sistema pa rin ho ba na yung paggasta ho ng savings na it turns out seems like a second budgeting process in itself. Kasi dito sa Kongreso, meron tayong budgeting process which is open to the public. Nanonood ho ang nakabukas po mga camera. But then there's a second budgeting process which happens in Malacanang among the DBCC, which is not to denigrate the capacities of the individuals. I think all the persons here as resource persons are outstanding individuals, but we must talk about processes and what are the safeguards in these processes. So we're talking about 144 billion. Ano ho yung taya ng taong bayan dyan? How do they participate? It's good that you're going to put it on the official gazette. You're going to put it online. But I notice a common thread ho, Mr. Chairman, in all of our legislative investigations. Sa fertilizer fund ho, sa Malampaya, which we haven't tackled, but it seems there are in the PDAF scam ho, there are all these colossal, malalaki hong lump sums na kahit kaming mga senador, kongresista, ano pa ba si Juan de la Cruz, hindi niya alam kung saan napupunta po yung pera niya. What can we do about this, Mr. Chairman?
That's why I think, in fact, we have been conceding a lot of our prerogatives to Congress so that Congress can meaningfully exercise its oversight function. Halimbawa, yung lump sums favors the executive. So what we have been trying to do is disaggregate those lump sums. Minsan nga na pinagagalitan kami dahil, halimbawa, yung irrigation projects, hindi namin nire-release kasi we put them in the negative list even if we already have the GAARD regime where the budget is considered the release document. Because, what do we require them? Dapat ang irrigation project or farm-to-market road project, may ID, may project description, mayroong naka-geotag. So you know the coordinates. So if you monitor using Google Map, periodically, makikita nyo kung yung kalibang yan nagagawa o hindi, o yung mga puno bang yan natatanim dun sa sinabi nila. So I think one of the ways by which we can embed the reforms is really to introduce a process of automating or digitizing the work of government so that the human intervention is much less. So yung mga ganun ho, palagay ko ho, ay mabibisang paraan para sa ganon, alam ng tao kung ano yung nangyayari. At pwede pa siyang makialam kasi alam pala niya na dun sa website ng DNR, alam niya kung yung 6 billion na National Greening Program, nakadetalye kung anong barangay, sino yung mga local PO na nanalo dun sa bidding para magtanim ng puno, gaano kalaking hektarya yan, ano yung coordinate. So, papayag ho kami na usisain nyo ng usisain lahat ng ahensya para sa ganon, hanggat maaari, maalis lahat ang lump sum sa mga budget. Maliban na lang dun sa mga lump sums na hindi talaga natin na madidisaggregate, katulad ng calamity fund, yung mga contingency fund.
Mr. Chair, well, I admire all these measures being taken, but I think, Mr. Chair, dapat palalimin pa po natin yung mga proseso, and we're willing to work with the executive branch dito. Dahil may kasabihan nga na sunshine is the best disinfectant o pinakamabisang pamatay ng mikrobyo, kumbaga. So I think that principle has to be furthered in the budgeting process kasi ang tingin talaga ng tao, ang hirap sundan ng pera nila. Hindi nila masundan sa napupunta. So that's the principle. It's a very simple principle, but I think our laws make it so convoluted. And that brings me to my next question, which is Executive Order 292 ba, yung revised administrative code.
That's correct.
Sa pagkaintindi ko kasi sa revised administrative code, ito ay was enacted in 1987, and ito ay isang in effect reenactment when President Cory Aquino still had legislative powers of a presidential decree of President Marcos, yung PD 1177. Tama ho ba yun?
Well, I haven't done the research then, but I have read references to the fact that that was used as one of the references for putting together that executive order. But perhaps former Senator Joker Arroyo can enlighten you on that.
Would you know if sections 38, 39, and 49 were in PD 1177?
Frankly, Mr. Chairman, I am not. I just read the EO, but I did not study, very in detail the provenance of the executive order.
Kasi ho, in large part, well, according to the chairman, who's very knowledgeable about legislative history, it's large part it's borrowed from PD 1177, the Marcos budgetary decree. So I think, Mr. Chair, baka panahon na para i-examine po yung PD 1177 at EO 292 in light of recent developments. Sapagkat, let's look at their origin. A presidential decree took the signature of President Marcos. Yung EO 292 took the signature of just one person, President Cory Aquino. Hindi napasyahan yan ng mga kinatawan po ng taong bayan. It was not presided over by a democratic. It was not subject to a democratic discussion, so to speak, Mr. Chair. And I think it's about time that we really look at how we spend the people's money, how we budget the people's money. I think we can do a better job, especially in the age of crowdsourcing, in the age of the internet, na talagang napakarami pong panggagalingan o sources of information po. Nandito po tayo, still sticking to these two really ancient and arcane laws ho, which were based on the signature of two people. And yet, you're spending the money of millions, of 100 million Filipinos ho. Parang I think maybe we can do better, and the Filipino people deserve better, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, my last request is for us to know how much of the DAP went to for lack of a better term, new appropriations, meaning there was no existing appropriation or item in the GAA, and it was augmented through savings.
Well, all augmentations require items of appropriations, even if they are in the unprogrammed appropriations. You have to be able to house them in an item of appropriations, even if the project is new. So all of them, both those within the program appropriations, as well as activities and projects that may fall under the unprogrammed appropriations, have in fact items of appropriations to which they can be referred to.
Well, that's the contention of the executive, but I think the Supreme Court has adopted a more restrictive view with respect to items and appropriations in the budget. Mr. Chair, is that correct?
I think the practice, Secretary Abad, is, I think that's SOP with the DBM. Dapat may item. Only that, Senator Ngara, they use an item, a lump sum item in the budget, augment that item, and from that lump sum item, draw up a list of new projects. Correct me if I'm wrong.
Well, there are three categories of items in the budget. They are called programs, activities, and projects. Projects can either be locally funded projects, which are funded from the general fund, or foreign assisted projects, which are funded from either loans or grants from abroad. So, you know, if a project can in fact be housed in a project, then that will qualify. It can also be housed in an activity or a program.
In other words, may item sa budget at may bahay ho palagi yun.
Palagi ho may bahay.
Anyway,
Well, as the economy grows and the needs increase, you know, you cannot be very specific about about your items in the budget. Otherwise, you
Lose
constrict
flexibility.
and make it very rigid for the executive to operate.
I see the point of the good secretary, Mr. Chair. Just a last point on Executive Order 292 or the revised administrative code. My understanding of sections 38, 39, and 49 is these are cash flow or revenue management mechanisms. But over time, they have evolved to become policy setting mechanisms. I wonder if that's the original intent, to have them as policy setting mechanisms and to give the executive the power to set policy in effect by having these huge appropriations. No? So I think that's something for Congress to look into going forward. And I take a cognizance also of the fact that the Aquino administration has really spent the people's money well, but as I said, we're not concerned with the present, we're more concerned with the future, Mr. Chair. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Angara. Next to ask questions and propound questions, Chair recognizes Senator Gingona. PG, you may proceed, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Much has been said already about savings and Section 38. In fact, that was already covered by Senate President Dillon. Therefore, I won't tackle that anymore. Let me just start with what was mentioned by Senator Angara. In the dispositive portion, in the decision of the Supreme Court, one of the items that were declared unconstitutional was letter C, funding of projects, activities, and programs that were not covered by any appropriations in the General Appropriation Act. And what was used as an example was an item in the DREAM, did they call it DREAM project? And the item was called Generation of New Knowledge and Technologies and Research Capability Building. Ang nangyari doon, yung nakalagay lang sa GAA para sa, ang may appropriation daw, para sa MOOE, which is the maintenance, what's O? Operating and other expenses. Okay, MOOE. Yet the augmentation covered personnel and capital outlay, as was shown in the decision. But, Secretary Abad, don't you think that there should be a distinction between what is an item and what is what they call an allotment class? Because an item is defined as a specific appropriation of money. And in this case, the item was the generation of new knowledge. But the allotment class, as distinguished from item, medyo technical lang to, pero importante to, sapagkat yung allotment class, yun ang sinasabi na whether it's personnel services, MOOE, and capital outlay. And if you look at the wording of the Constitution, what can be augmented are items. So there seems to be a confusion between what is an item and what is an allotment class. Mr. Secretary, your thoughts on this?
Well, you're beginning to sound like an expert in the budget, sir. I think that is really the case. In fact, there is jurisprudence on this. The case of Bengson, GR number 103524, where it made it clear there that what the Constitution requires is an item of appropriation, and the Constitution does not look for the allotment class, which is really the PS, MOE, and capital outlay. For as long as there is an item of appropriation, then it is possible for savings to be augmented, for savings to be used to augment that particular item which is deficient.
So that is one point that I think the Supreme Court, the Honorable Supreme Court, should most probably revisit when they take a look at the motion for reconsideration.
That's why we are surprised, and I think I don't know if it was Senate President Rilon who I think correctly pointed out that some of these issues are not really constitutional issues. They are interpretations of laws, and therefore to elevate them to being constitutional issues, I think misses the fact that these are really differences in terms of construction or interpretation, Mr. Chairman.
Correct. Like, for example, savings. Savings is mentioned in the Constitution, but it is not defined in the Constitution.
That's correct.
The definition of savings is found in the GAA of each and every year.
That's correct.
So if there is if they call it a misinterpretation, then it's not a violation of the Constitution. It is definitely a misinterpretation of law, if ever there is any.
That is why I think what should have happened there is for the executive and the legislature, if the legislature feels that the way we implemented the definition of savings in the GAA is contrary to what they had in mind, then we are accountable to the legislature.
Yes, correct. Let's move on to the issue of the unprogrammed funds, which says, the Supreme Court said, it declares void the use of unprogrammed funds despite the absence of certification by the National Treasurer that the revenue collections exceeded the revenue targets. Revenue collections exceeded revenue targets. The main debate here, I think, is whether revenue targets and revenue collection should be taken as an aggregate whole or should be interpreted as a revenue target versus an actual collection of each revenue account. Because to my mind, is it not true, Mr. Secretary, that if you were to take in the revenue collections as an aggregate, then you would have to wait for the Bureau of Treasury to issue a certification. Am I correct?
Yes, which
comes at the end of the years, of course. Am I correct?
Not exactly, not literally at the end of the year, but in most instances at the end of the first quarter, because what happens there...
at the end of the first quarter of the succeeding year?
Yes, March. Because what happens there is there would be a need for, especially the main revenue drivers, Bureau of Internal Revenue and Bureau of Customs, to reconcile their figures with the Bureau of Treasury. And usually that takes a while because you have to wait for all the numbers to come in from the different revenue centers all over the country. And after that, when there is a reconciliation, the Commission on Audit has to audit that reconciliation. And it is only after the Commission on Audit that has been able to audit the reconciliation that the Treasury can now prepare what is called a cash operations report. That can show whether, in fact, if you look at the total actual collections, are either bigger than revenue as program or less. And so that would be sometime in March. Now, if you have to procure your project, that will take you another 4 to 6 months. So sometime in September, so that by the time you're implementing project, you're well into the last quarter of the next year.
So in effect, if that would be the interpretation that we take revenue targets and revenue collections in the aggregate sense, then it would render nugatory, or it would defeat the purpose for which the unprogrammed fund was put up for.
Yeah, because
Is that
by,
not correct?
by the term itself, standby appropriations. As I go back to my earlier point that when we put together the budget, it's usually a year before it is implemented. So in between, you would have instances where certain needs, certain contingencies crop up that you did not consider when you put together the budget. So
Most definitely.
That's why Congress grants us this standby appropriation to respond to those contingencies or emerging needs, Mr. Chairman.
So then, there it is. The debate there would be whether really to take it in its aggregate or from each revenue source. And besides, it says so plural. So baka that already implies that plural means from each revenue source. That's another added
The
point.
other problem is because Secretary Purissima is, is a very hard driver of revenue raising. He sets the targets of BOC and BIR very high. and of course, I think if you set the targets to a level where people can easily attain them, you're not driving them to collect harder. So they're set high. And, in many instances, you're unable actually to collect at the level that was required by, for example, the Department of Finance. So if that happens, then you'll never get to...
You'll never be able to get any unprogrammed funds.
yes.
Okay, I guess that point should be well taken, and that point is well taken, and I think the Supreme Court should revisit that point, no? Because they did interpret it as the aggregate.
Yes, instead of the individual sources of revenue, which we do, as I explained earlier with respect to, for example, GOCC dividends, we're able to determine, for example, at the end of March, how much excess revenues can be derived from GOCC dividends.
With those points, Mr. Chairman, I'm through. Thank you very much, Mr. Secretary.
Thank you, Senator Gingona. Going through the list, Senator Aquino, good afternoon. You may proceed, sir.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman. Good afternoon, Secretary Abad, Secretary Purisma, and Secretary Balisacan, as well as the secretaries in the back. Siguro I'd like to put us back into context. No? I think we're talking a lot about technicalities and even about provisions of law, no? And rightfully so, and a lot of my colleagues have already talked about that. But I'd like to go back to context. I remember in the President's speech, no, there was a reference to pagpasok noong 2010, very little of the budget was actually left, and that actually triggered the need to really go into budget reform. Could you give us again, could you share again that figure, Mr. Secretary? Magkano po yung natira sa 2010 budget pagpasok ng Aquino administration?
In terms of the non-recurring portion of the budget, which is really your development fund, when we came in the middle of the year, we only had about 100 billion pesos left to spend.
So 100 billion pesos for 6 months more, no? Okay.
Correct.
So with that, Mr. Secretary, nakita nyo rin, sa panaliksik ninyo dun sa budget, marami talaga mga butas, maraming kailangan baguhin at ayusin, and you started to go into budget reform, no? This was not the only budget reform that you've done. Could you tell us again, what were the other items that you tried to reform in the budget process?
Well, the first thing is, transparency in the use of public funds. That's why we set up websites in the DBM so that, you can see all the items of the GAA in our website. The second one is we insisted that the budget should be as detailed as possible. So we discourage agencies from resorting to lump sum funds. Apart from the fact that they're opaque, the other problem is when you go to implementation, normally agencies are prepared to or are able to finish disaggregating their budgets towards the middle of the year, and by that time you would have been very delayed in budget execution. The third one is this GAARD we call, which is the GAA as the released document, which means the agencies don't need to go back to DBM to ask for SAROS or agency budget matrices. The fourth is requiring agencies, especially the implementing agencies like infrastructure agencies, to begin procuring their infrastructure projects after we submit the NEP to Congress, which is really beginning August. In fact, we are now even compelling them, and that to make sure that they do that, we're allowing them to establish more bids and awards committees and hire full-time back people so that they can perform their procurement functions better. So, I mean, these are the reforms that we have among them.
Yeah, Mr. Secretary, so you mentioned a number of things, no? Looking at lump sum budgets, being more transparent, using the GAA as a release document. I'm sure meron na kayo nakitang mga programa o mga allocations na siguro corruption ridden or may mga issues on corruption. What did you do with regard to those items, projects, or activities, no, however you want to call it, na nakita ho ninyo prone to corruption or meron pong mga issues doon? What did you do
Well,
there?
for example, a concrete example is the distribution of NFA rice, the cheap rice. We found out that only 22% of the poor people actually, were the beneficiaries of the NFA cheap rice. And there was a COA finding that a greater part of that was really bought by traders who turn around, mix it with commercial rice and sold them for higher prices. And so what we did is we canceled that project. And we said that I think CCT is a better way of helping the poor urban consumers because it's a directed subsidy where you know who the poor are, where they live, and so therefore you can directly and make sure that the subsidy goes to them directly. So that's one example.
So, okay. So may mga nalinis po kayo mga programa, may mga proseso na naging mas efficient, mas naging transparent. I know that you also welcome suggestions from civil society and from regular people, no, with regard to budget items or things to be funded. With all of these reforms, nagkakaroon po tayo ng savings, no? And I remember in 2012, I spoke to Secretary Purisima and he gave a number like hundreds of billions are saved because of our anti-corruption measures, no, and trying to be more efficient, no. So nagkakaroon ho tayo ng savings dahil gusto ho nating mas magasta yung pera ng bayan na mas maayos. Okay, nagkakaroon ho tayo ng savings. Yung savings na yon ginagamit para sa mga tao. Now, the Supreme Court decision talks about the process by which this was allocated. Tama po ba?
Yes.
So ang pinupuntirya po ng Supreme Court is really more that process which is the DAP program, no? And not even the whole DAP program but just parts of it. So at any point wala pong pinag-uusapan na paggamit connected to corruption, paggamit connected sa may binulsang pera because currently a number of groups and detractors are trying to equate the DAP to corruption or to basically binubulsa yung pera. So I'd just like to make it clear, no? Dito po sa pagkakaroon ng DAP, it's actually because nilalabanan yung corruption to begin with, no?
Yeah, ironically, ganyan ang reaction ng, some detractors. But really, the objective here is to promote greater transparency and accountability in the management of public funds. Kaya nga, meron tayong performance-informed budgeting at we're targeting that by the end of 2014, we should be operating checkless and at least 80% cashless. Para ang transaction, bank-to-bank na lang. For example, yung pagbibigay ng sweldo sa mga empleyado, may mga gumagamit pa ng envelope at binibigay yung cash. Ngayon nagpa-pilot na kami ngayong taon para ang sweldo ng mga empleyado mula sa treasury, diretso na sa bank account. So walang ibang dinadaanan. O halimbawa, the remittance of GSI's premiums, pinanggagalingan din niya ng maraming problema. ang Treasury na ang magbibigay ng premiums ng mga GSIS employees natin diretso to the GSIS, and that way you really avoid paperwork and also the opportunities for leakages.
So in this drive for corruption, you're being accused of corruption, no? Parang ganoon po yung nangyayari. Let me go further into this, no. Hindi ako nagkakamali, alam ko na meron pong mga nagparangal sa DBM with regard to the budgeting process or reforms. I think the World Bank was one of those, no, if I'm not mistaken.
Nagpapasalamat naman ho kami.
But what exactly did they commend you for?
Well, I think the very first one is yung aming open budget system. Sinusubukan namin lahat ng posibleng data na we can share with the public in our website at saka dun sa official gazette. Kasi yun ang isa sa tinitingnan ng iba ay mai-upload natin sa ating website para malaman ng tao talaga kung ano ang nangyayari sa pera ng bayan. Pangalawa, yung engagement namin with citizenry, yung budget partnership agreement, yung bottom-up budgeting, at yung pagpapalakas ng mga public financial management ng mga local government units. Ayun ho ang pangatlo, ay natutuwa rin sila dito sa performance-informed budgeting kasi mas mapapalakas ang oversight function ng mga ahensya katulad ng Kongreso dahil paglapit namin sa inyo, paghingi ng pera ng ahensya, ang kapalit na sasabihin sa inyo, ano yung ibabalik nyong serbisyo? Ilang eskwelahan, gaano katagal ang pag-process ng passport o ng driver's license?
So all of these reforms, Secretary, no, na parangalan o binibigyan ng parangal, these days hindi ho yan na pag-uusapan, ano?
Hindi naman. No.
Hindi na, no? So sana ho mapag-usapan pa. Okay. I would like to commend you, no, for choosing to upload that full list to the internet. No, I think that's something that a lot of people are waiting for. Tama po bang understanding ko na wala pa po dyan kung kaninong o sino yung nagrekomenda? No, that list does not contain that yet, but it will eventually.
Namin ho. Kasi ito ho, nakabatay dun sa nakalagay sa SARO. So, nakalagay yung SARO number, SARO date.
But not who nominated, no?
Wala pa kasi sa SARO hindi nyo makikita yon. Pero
in the words of SP, yung nagnombra nung a new term for today.
Kailangan naming balikan yung records ng mga nag-nominate ng project para maitugma natin dito sa mga project na to.
Secretary Abad, you're committing that maybe within the next few weeks, you will upload that with the legislators who recommended those projects.
Well, ngayon ho, meron ng instructions to upload this in the DBM website tsaka sa official gazette today.
Okay.
So itong listahan na ito. Over the next few weeks, we will follow with the list where of the list where legislators nominated projects.
I think that's very commendable, Secretary, because yan talaga yung hinahanap ng taong bayan. And I think that move should lay to rest already any questions in terms of where the money went. No? I'd like to ask also about the amount of money we're talking about. No? So, dito po sa listahan po natin, we have 144.3 billion. Just to take 2013 as an example, and only because I was a senator only in 2013, the budget that we passed was 2.26 trillion, right? So we're talking about 8.9 billion out of 2.26 trillion, which really is just 0.4% of the whole budget.
In fact, if you total the 3 years where we implemented DAP and look at it as a proportion of the total budgets for 3 years, it's about 2.6%.
2.6%.
Yung kabuuan na
ng DAP.
144 billion.
Opo, kasi sa totoo lang, a lot of people are talking, it's as if the whole budget was actually realigned, no? That actually happened in previous years, no? That whole budgets were, when budgets are reenacted, actually, pwede ho yung galawin lahat, di ba?
Yeah, for about, in 3 years, the budget was fully reenacted. Ibig sabihin, wala talagang bagong programang...
So 100% pwede pong galawin yun ng executive?
Well, the non-recurring siguro. Kasi yung mga sweldo and entitlements, hindi pwedeng galawin. Pero yung, which is about, sa ngayon kasi, ang non-recurring is about 35% of the budget.
Okay, but this particular case of the DAP, is actually just 2.6% of the total budget of the 3 years in question.
That's correct.
Okay. Is 2.6% na savings, is that par for the... Normal po ba yun? Mataas po ba yun on a yearly basis or in a period of 3 years? Is that a high amount or a low amount?
Usually at the end of the year, we hit about 98 or 97% of the budget spent. So maliit lang talaga ang natitira.
Compared to previous administrations, is that a high amount or a low amount? Normal lang po ba yun o mataas po yun?
Well, kasi itong the past 10 years have been extraordinary years kasi every year the budget was reenacted.
So virtually, ano po yung savings nun? Talagang
Malalaki.
malalaki.
It's in the hundreds of billions. Yeah.
Okay. So in short, itong issue ho na to is about 2.6% of 3 years budget where you're going to upload already kung saan po ito napunta at kung sinong dun sa porsyento man na may legislators na nag-nominate, it will also be there and people can check for themselves.
That's correct.
Yung nasabi po ng Supreme Court na bawal is what percent of the 2.6%? Would you have that number? Or lahat ba ng 2.6% yung pinagbawal ng Supreme Court?
Hindi, those that pertain to yung withdrawal of unobligated allotments and the yung unreleased appropriations tsaka dun sa unprogrammed appropriations. Pero ho dun sa mga alimbawa savings on personnel o di kaya savings arising from efficiency measures that you adopted, hindi ho yun ipinagbabawal ng Korte Suprema.
So it's an even smaller percentage of the 2.6%?
Well, it's about 45.8 billion.
Okay. So roughly about 0.8%.
Yes.
Okay. So we're talking about 0.8% of the 3 years na budget na pinagbawal ng Supreme Court na bago nila pinagbawal, hindi naman bawal noon.
Hindi naman.
Okay. Sige. And maybe as a final question, I'd like to talk about good faith and bad faith. Palagay ko po kasi ito yung isang matinding sticking point, no? And probably this is what also got a lot of people's attention. Ano ho ba ang ibig sabihin ng good faith tsaka bad faith?
Well, ito ho yung doctrine of operative fact. No? Ang sinasabi lang ng doctrine of operative fact, kapag ang isang batas o executive fiat or issuance ay nadeklarang unconstitutional. Bago siya nadeklarang unconstitutional, it was a fact, it was an operative fact that it was a valid law
So
with
nangyayari
consequences.
Nangyayari na.
Nangyayari na at meron siyang nagiging resulta. May mga kaling nagagawa, merong eskwelahan na nagagawa. Kaya ang sinasabi ng doctrine of operative fact na hindi natin pwede, kasi ang general rule, pag nadeklarang unconstitutional ang isang batas, dapat wala siyang epekto. Dapat wala siyang epekto. Pero in this instance, kasi nangyari ito, bago siya madeklara, sabi ng doktrinang ito, in the interest of fairness and equity, dapat nating tanggapin na tama naman at pabayaan na lang natin yung nagawa na. Total, nung ginawa ito, hindi naman bawal. And therefore, we have to presume that all of those acts and all of those people who did those acts were in good faith. Were in good faith. At kaya, kung meron mang nagawa labag dito sa declaration of unconstitutionality, should only be looked at prospectively. Dapat ang application nito
forward-looking, no?
Panghinaharap.
Ano po yung nakalagay sa Supreme Court regarding good faith and bad faith?
Sabi ng Supreme Court, sa umpisa, kasi maganda yung takbo, sabi niya, the doctrine of operative fact should apply to the conception and implementation of the disbursement allocation program. Kasi ang premise niya before that is, maganda naman ang naidulot nitong disbursement acceleration program sa ating bansa. Sabi na, it is undisputable. And in fact, we cannot count the numerous benefits derived from the DAP. So, and therefore, the doctrine should apply. Kaya nga nagtaka kami dun sa bandang dulo, there were 2 paragraphs seemingly out of place. Kasi sinasabi niya, well, sige, let's apply the doctrine and the presumption of good faith dun sa mga actions, yung mga projects, kung lalong-lalo na kung natapos na. Pero, insofar as the authors and sponsors and implementers of those projects, they have to be presumed in bad faith unless they can prove otherwise in criminal, civilian,
or
and administrative tribunals, which means you're also presumed to be criminally, administratively, and civilly liable.
Okay. So, in short, sinabi po ng Supreme Court, maganda yung dinulot nung programa. We can assume the doctrine of operative fact. Pero yung mga taong may kinalaman dito, presume guilty sila.
Well, presume in bad faith.
In bad faith, okay. Pag sinabi ho nating bad faith, may masamang balak, ano bang ibig sabihin ng bad faith?
Well, alam nila na mali yun, pero ginawa pa rin nila.
Okay. And kasi marami nagtatanong, bakit pa daw nag-MR ang gobyerno? Bakit pa nag-motion for reconsideration? Bakit di nilang tinanggap yung desisyon? Yan yung tanong ng tao. So tama po bang isipin na ang pagtanggap ng desisyon is to agree and to admit na meron kayong masamang binabalak at ginawa nyo pa rin yung programa. So, to accept the decision is to admit bad faith. Tama po ba? Is that the...
Exactly, and to admit the fact that the basic principles of presumption of innocence and presumption of regularity in the performance of public officials of their functions and responsibilities. You give all of that up if you agree to that decision.
So, kaya kayo nagmo-motion for reconsideration
among
other things, no? Dahil hindi nyo po matanggap na siyempre, ang sinasabi ng Supreme Court, may masamang bala kayo. At mukha namang wala, di ba?
Kaya nga nakapagtataka dahil dun sa kalakihan ng bahagi ng ponensya, sinasabi maganda yung DAP. At in fact, you should be considered in good faith. Kasi maganda naman yung idinulat. Pero sa dulo, mukhang nabawi. So yun ang hindi namin maintindihan.
Okay. As a final question, Mr. Chairman, with regard to savings, is it time, Mr. Secretary, that we define savings legally as a co-equal branch of government, that Congress and the Senate define savings once and for all? I know that there's a definition in the GAA, but of course that is subject every year to a new GAA. Should we define it finally para we lay this issue to rest?
Yes, it's possible so that it's not a yearly redefinition or revisiting of what savings really means. So it's possible to put it in a legislation, provided that, as I said, there is appreciation for the need of the executive to be flexible, considering the complexities of governing a society like us, Mr. Chairman.
Okay. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Secretary Abad, just to clarify, you said in response to the question of Senator Aquino that 45.8 billion or 27% of the total 144 billion, yun yung illegal under the Supreme Court decision? Did I get you correctly?
Hindi naman. Well, sa aming, yun yung kinwestiyon ng Korte Suprema.
No. Yun yung sinasabi ng Korte Suprema na bumabagsak dun sa apat na hindi tumugon sa definition ng savings, walang item, cross-border, at unprogrammed na walang National Treasurer certification.
Yes, just to give you the details, may dalawang item dito yung withdrawn unobligated allotment.
That's the first.
Yung isa yung unprogrammed fund.
That's the fourth.
Kaya siya naging 45. Kasi 28.2 billion yung isa, 17.6. The other sources of savings, which we believe was not questioned by the Supreme Court, was unreleased personnel services na umaabot yan ng mga 109.6 billion at saka yung mga projects discontinued na umaabot ng
Wait lang po.
53.
Ano po yung universe, Secretary? Ang universe po bang pinag-uusapan natin is 237? Total savings from 2011. That's the universe.
237, tama ho kayo.
237 is the universe. Of 237, 109 is personnel.
Yung 237 is overall savings from 2010 to 2013. Tama yan.
Now, of the total savings, 167 is DAP. Na may proposed, ang actual release is 144.
Tama ho yun.
So sa 144, alin po doon whether you agree or disagree, alin po doon ang lumalabag sa konstitusyon ayon sa Korte Suprema? Again, whether you agree with it or not, because the Supreme Court identified 4 activities. Now, of this 144 billion, alin at magkano po yung bumabagsak dun sa 4 na yun? Again, whether you've explained fully that you disagree with the decision, but
Dito ho, the comment of Senator Bongbong becomes relevant because we just pulled the savings. We cannot tell you which money went to which projects. Because the attribution is difficult to make because at the end of the day, we pull the savings. So it's difficult for me to answer you, which items here in the sources of savings go to actual list of projects in the 160.
example sec, cross-border. Kung ang total savings ng COA for year X is let's say 10 billion, kunwari lang, yung nabigay bang DAP sa kanya, nag-exceed doon o hindi? Kung hindi nag-exceed, then clearly there is no cross-border. Diba? I mean,
Unlike in the past, Mr. Chairman, we did not impound the appropriations of agencies. So wala kaming kinuha dun sa kabila. Ang lahat ng savings na ito ay savings ng executive.
So, kung may nabigay man sa constitutional commissions, sa judiciary, o sa Kongreso, cross-border na yun.
Oo. Purely coming from the the only exception was in the case of the House of Representatives building. Kasi merong
Advance yun parang advance
meron
diba?
Meron ang House of Representatives something like 200 million pero ang kailangan niya
45.
245. So sabi niya ibabalik ko na lang sa inyo yung inisyue na sa amin noon pero you give us 245. So we just added 45 billion to their original appropriation. Yun lang, but that's the only exception that I can recall.
So, lahat yon would be cross-border. Can you give us that list and the amounts? Cross-border, covered natin. Items sa budget, I talked to a lot of DBM officials and I know how kung gaano po kasinop sila magtrabaho. Palaging may item yan, imposibleng wala.
Maski na ho, natutulog yan. Alam nila na dapat lagyan ng item ho yung bawat
Palagi may
appropriation.
item. Penge po nung listahan ng unprogrammed na binabanggit ng Korte. Para lang po ma-identify natin which is which. Again, I know you vehemently disagree with the decision. There is still a pending motion for reconsideration. But moving forward, we need to identify which ones will be hit if and when the Supreme Court decision is not changed and becomes final.
We will do that, Mr. Chairman.
And finally, yun sa definition ng savings na binabanggit ng Korte, that's the first supposedly unconstitutional act according to the Court. Yung hindi sumunod daw sa definition ng savings, meaning hindi pa na-obligate, kinuha na. May ganun po ba?
Tama ho yan. Kasi we release allotments that the agencies should obligate. Ngayon, pag hindi nila na-obligate at the end of the semester, then we sit down with them, we send account management teams, what is happening? Ano ba, kaya nyo pa ba yan for the next 6
Again,
months na
I'm not
ma-obligate?
necessarily disagreeing with you, but according to the Court, that is illegal. Ano-ano ngayon yung mga projects na yon at magkano po yun? Just to be able to disaggregate the amounts involved in that.
That will be a little difficult to do right away, but if you give us some time, we may be able to do that.
We will, but there is a need to so identify para yung hindi naman illegal according to the Court, tanggalin na ho natin sa issue at huwag na natin idamay. Yung supposedly illegal moving forward, what can and should be done now?
Yun ang problema kasi dun sa mga, halimbawa, yung unreleased appropriation, unobligated allotments, we pull those savings. So, hindi namin pwedeng masabi ho sa inyo na alin dito sa mga proyektong ito ay nakatanggap ng legal or illegal na savings.
No, as a source po muna.
As a source, as a source, pwede namin
Source
gawin.
lang po.
Okay.
Source lang po muna because we understand that it's fungible anyway.
Yes.
Thank you, Secretary Bat. Senator Recto and then Senator Osmeña.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Magandang hapon na Secretary Butch, Secretary Cesar, Secretary RC, and to all the other cabinet members. Maraming salamat sa inyong pagdating dito sa ating pagdinig. Unang-una gusto ko sabihin, Secretary, na malaki ang aking tiwala sa inyo at sa ating Pangulo. Sa paggawa ninyo ng DAP, hindi ako naniniwalang meron kayong bad faith doon. No? lalong mahirap paniwalaan na ang ating Pangulo ay iisipin niya na gawin itong DAP na to para waldasin ang pera ng taong bayan. That is farthest, I suppose, from the truth. No? So let me put that on record to begin with. No? My questions will be on the issue of basically, ang pinag-uusapan natin dito, Secretary, pera ng pamalaan na galing sa buwis ng mamamayan. No? So ang karamihan ng tanong ko, alam natin technical ang issue nito sa budgeting. No? At iilan lang talaga ang nakakaintindi. No? Ay tungkol nga dito. Ito'y pera ng taong bayan galing sa buwis na pinaghirapan. No? Okay. Before I get to my questions, the significant substantive questions, Secretary, just a few clarifications. No? Ang budget ng ating pamalaan for the last 3 years would roughly be anywhere between 5.5 trillion pesos. No? Nabanggit na ninyo kanina magkano yung budget ng 2011, 12, at 13. No? Nabanggit din ninyo, just a clarification, Secretary, 237.5 billion yung savings nung 3 taon. Tama ba yung pagdinig kong yan?
Yan ho ang overall savings ho, for the 3 years.
Sa madaling salita, ang
Pero,
yes,
just to qualify that a bit,
Yes, oo.
sinama ho namin yung 2010 doon. Meron hong savings galing sa taong 2010.
Okay, so sa madaling salita, Secretary, you did not overspend in 2011, 12, and 13. Kasi, syempre, ang budget is an authority to spend na pinahintulot ng Kongreso. There is no overspending.
Wala ho.
Kasi may savings nga eh.
Oo.
Okay? So, tama ba yung pagkaunawa ko, Secretary, na 237.5 billion yung savings ng 3 taon na pwedeng gamitin sana na pinul for DAP purposes?
Pwede ho yan.
Okay. Thank you for that reply, Secretary. Tapos, 167 billion, yung nabanggit nyo kanina, projects proposed to be funded. Tama po ba yun?
Tama ho yan.
Okay. Bakit hindi nyo pinopose yung 237? Bakit 167 lang?
Well, nakabatay din ho yun sa yung kapasidad o yung absorption ng mga ahensya. Kasi we have to admit na isa ho rin tong malaking issue na maski na meron tayong pondo.
Naunawa ko na po, Secretary, para hindi na natin pahabaan. Thank you for that reply, Secretary. At dun sa 167, ang inaprubahan lang ng Pangulo ay 144. Tama po ba yun?
Ang inaprubahan niya 157 pero ang na-release 144.
Okay, thank you for that clarification. Sa makatwid, anong mangyayari ngayon sa diferensya ng 237 at 144? Yan ba ay pwedeng gastusin pa rin at DAP o ibang pangalan o hindi na ninyo gagastusin yan?
Well, may mga bahagi nun na pwede pang gamitin bilang karaniwang savings. At ang bahagi nun at gugustuhin siguro ni Secretary Purisima, baka gamitin na lang natin para mapababa yung ating deficit.
Maganda sinabi mong yun. Ano? Gawa nung pag sinabi mong babawasan natin yung deficit, ibig sabihin, hindi na tayo uutang.
Tama po
Kasi kung lumalaki ang utang natin, napipilitan ng pamalaan na mag-wish sa taong bayan.
Tama
Kaya
po yan.
ididikit ko sa usapang yon. No? Ano po, Secretary? So, correct me if I'm wrong, my impression is, hindi na ninyo gagalawin yung diferensya ng 237 at 144.
Well, hindi ko ho alam kung yung diferensya ay yung numero pa rin yun hanggat sa ngayon. Baka posible kasing dahil sa maraming kalamidad na pumasok sa ating bansa, baka nagamit doon yung iba. So kailangan lang natin tingnan kung meron pang...
Remember, ang pinag-uusapan natin dito, so far, are just appropriations cover.
That's right.
Hindi naman cash itong pinag-uusapan ba eh. Hindi pa naman lahat ito binabayaran sa mga contractors, so on and so forth eh.
Hindi pa rin ho.
Tama po ba yun?
Dahil lang implementation naman ay tumatakbo as we speak.
Tama. Okay. Let me move on now, Secretary. No? Katulad ng maraming tanong kanina napakahalaga para sa aming malaman at ganoon din sa taong bayan. No? At before I say that, let me first congratulate the Secretary for the many reforms initiated in the budget. No? Succeed din ako dyan. Gawa nung kasama ko si Secretary Escudero din na nagdedepensa ng budget ninyo. No? For the last how many years? Simula 2010 hanggang 2011 hanggang 2013. No? So saksi ako dito sa maraming reform na nagagawa ninyo. At gusto ko rin sabihin, ang naging problema naman dito sa DAP, so far walang nagsasabing may nakawan. Okay? Ang problema dito ay yung proseso. Ang maraming tanong dito ay tungkol sa proseso. No? Alam ko marami rin kayong ginawang transparency measure sa budget. Kung kahit ngayon lang tayo nakakakita sa internet, sa website, yung mga pinagagastusan. Ngunit nagtataka din ako, Secretary, na ilang taon na nakalipas, ngayon lang nagkaroon ng paglabas nung DAP sa website. Bakit kaya ngayon lang?
Well, sa totoo lang, marami pa sanang pwedeng ilagay dyan. Oo. Ang isang dahilan dyan ay yung meron kasi kami ngayon kasalukuyan na ipinapatupad na tawag Government Integrated Financial Management Information System na pag nabuo ito in 2016, real time, lahat ng allotments, lahat ng obligations, lahat ng disbursements in cash, upload yan real time sa aming website. It's really more capacity constraint, Mr.
I
Chairman.
understand, Secretary. And before I proceed with my first question, no, yung nabanggit kanina ni Senator Angara, pareho kami at palagi ko maraming Pilipino, malaki ang tiwala sa ating Pangulo. No? Remember, ang problema dito, proseso. At ang pinag-uusapan natin dito, daang bilyong piso. 145 billion of taxpayers' money na pinaghirapan. Na para bagang maraming nagugulat, ngayon lang to nakikita ang mga pinaggastusan nito. Dahil hindi natalakay sa Kongreso to. So it would appear there is no authorization from Congress. Ano po? Of course, naintindihan ko, meron tayong administrative code na yun ang pinagbabatayan ninyong basihan legal para gawing ito. No? Oh, let me start now, Secretary. Number one, sources of savings. Etong 237 at yung pinaggastos ng 144, halimbawa, no? Maaari bang ibigay ninyo sa amin yung detalye kung saan nanggaling yung savings na ito?
Mr. Chairman, ganda na ho yung kaninang
That's right.
hiningi.
So ibibigay ninyo sa amin. Paano nyo ibibigay ito? Halimbawa, by department, by expense class, paano ba kaya ito?
Kaya naman by department at saka by expense class.
Okay. Palagay ko naman, rough figures lang, Secretary. Kasi baka hindi na tayo magkaroon ng pagdinig dito ulit eh. So mabigyan nga ninyo kami ng dokumento, pero baka hindi natin mapag-usapan ulit ito dahil palagay ko sa darating na malinggo, pag-uusapan na natin yung 2015 budget eh. Ano ba? Let me follow up on some points raised earlier. No? Magkano ba talaga ang savings sa PS? I didn't want to interject earlier para wag masira yung trend of thought ng mga ibang kasamahan natin eh.
Umaabot ho ng mga 145 billion pesos.
100 ang PS savings. 145 billion pesos. Kasing laki nung DAP na ginastos.
Mga ganun ho.
Mga ganon. Okay. What about MOE and capital outlay? So the balance will be in the 237. 145 is PS, galing sa sweldo, and the balance will be 237 minus 145 would be MOE and capital outlay. Am I correct? To simplify. To simplify. Of course, may breakdown yan. Kada department, pwede nyo ibigay sa amin, ano?
Pwede rin.
Okay. Now, again, let me point out, kung meron tayong savings na 237, let me tie it to what I said earlier about taxes. Kung meron tayong 237, kaya maganda kung may deliberative body katulad ng Kongreso din eh. Kung meron para tayong potential savings every 3 years, or in this case, the last 3 years ka, na 237, at may mga panukalang batas dito sa Kongreso, halimbawa, na i-adjust na natin ang tama, magkaroon tayo ng tax reform sa income tax bracket. Dahil halimbawa, by 2016, halos lahat papalo na sa 30% ang income tax bracket. Hindi ba dapat pinag-uusapan din natin yan? Na halimbawa, mahina naman yung absorptive capacity ng gobyerno. Hindi pala kayang gastusin lahat. Bakit hindi natin bawasan ang buwis sa middle class? Halimbawa, at sabi ng saligang batas, kailangan progressive yung taxation natin. Anong ibig sabihin nun? Pag mayaman ka, mas malaki ang buwis na babayaran mo, mahirap ka, mas maliit ang buwis, minimum wage earner ka nga, wala kang babayaran, in between that, siguro bawas-bawasan natin. Palagay ko, malaki may tutulong nun sa paglago din ng ekonomiya. So that is the point, Secretary. Kaya mahalaga pinag-uusapan to mga bagay na to. No? Yan ba iniisip ngayon ng ating pamalaan in the next 2 years? Moving forward, hindi na DAP, moving forward. From our experience, nararapat na bang pag-usapan natin yun na some tax reform? Nang sa ganun, hindi umabot yung pangkaraniwang mamamayan maging 32% na rin, katulad ng pinakamayayaman, yung kanilang tax bracket by 2016 or 2017, thereabouts. Halos magdidikit na eh. Because the last time we adjusted this was in 1997. If you do not have a reply, that is okay for me. I just wanted to put that on record.
I think Secretary Purisima
Yes,
would be in a
Secretary.
better position
Sure.
to reply. Can I just...
Yes, please, Secretary. Yes.
Mr. Chair, Senator, we have an ongoing review of the whole tax structure, not just the rates on income taxes, but the whole system of taxation of the Philippines, with the objective of one, making it more progressive and equitable, but also making it easier to implement. In fact, we've engaged the IMF and the World Bank to assist us in that process. We're not yet ready to come up with the results, but yes, this is
Tanggap ko
something
na po
that's
ang sagutan ninyo. You are not ready to discuss the matter at this point and you're reviewing it. Ang gusto ko lang sabihin, Secretary, kung iisipin niyo yung total reform of the tax code, hindi natin matatapos yan. Palagay ko, mag-umpisa tayo dun sa income tax reform na muna. Yun lang ang aking suggestion. I will not belabor the point, Mr. Secretary. As I said earlier, ang pinag-uusapan natin dito, lahat, taxpayers' money. Ano po? Next point, Secretary, and maybe even to Secretary R.C. Balisacan and to a representative from the DBM, that will be fine with me. Nabanggit ninyo, 145 billion ang savings sa PS. Sa budget ng ating pamahalaan, ilang porsyento ba ang PS? Halimbawa, 2013, ang budget natin 2.12 trillion pesos. Magkano ang PS doon?
Mr. Chair, may I
Yes,
call
please.
on
Yes, yes.
Yusek Pascua? The answer is about 30%, but I think she is the more
So
knowledgeable.
roughly 700 billion.
I think, sir, it will be about that much.
Magkano?
About 700 billion.
Mga 700, tama. Sa madaling salita, mga 50 billion yung savings nyo in a year. Kung 3 years, 145 eh. 50 billion yun. So, ibig sabihin, we appropriate for 700, pero yung totoong nagagastos, 650 lang. May savings tayo ng 50. Tama po ba yun? And we were willing to appropriate up to 700. Is that correct?
Yes, sir. Usually, the big part is for the new positions.
I understand. Na hindi na fill up.
Yung mga teachers.
Na automatically nagiging savings.
Mga judges. Kailan
Na pag
po
naging
yun?
savings na yan, pwede nang gamitin yung kapangyarihan ng administrative code. Tama? Okay. Bakit hindi kaya pag-isipan na rin natin? Marami ngayon na kawani ng pamahalaan, lalo na ang ating mga guro na nagsasabing, baka naman pwede itaas na rin ng ating sweldo. O di kaya, kung hindi naman yung sweldo, yung, tawag doon, yung, that portion in the budget, yung for the, pera. Halimbawa, bakit hindi na lang natin taasan yung pera? Those allowances that we give government employees, palagay ko, quick disbursement acceleration din yun. At walang pera mawawala doon. Walang pwedeng nakawin doon. Di kaya? Tama pa ba yun? Pwede bang...
Well, sir, there is a proposal that we will do that's part of the 2015 budget.
So pinag-iisipan na ninyo yan?
Pinag-iisipan na namin.
Very good.
Pati yung review ng position classification for pinag-aaral na
Tama po yun.
namin.
So when you say review of position and classification, again, katulad ng tax reform yan, ito, very comprehensive. Tama? And dapat lang natin gawin yon. Although, ang sinasabi ko rin naman, ito across the board pera, simple lang. And you can compute it easily. At magkakaroon pa rin ng savings ng konti na lang dun sa PS naman. Remember, we were willing to appropriate 700 billion na gastos para sa sweldo ng empleyado. Pero alam natin, taon-taon, hindi natin nagagastos yun hanggang 650 lang. More or less. So bakit hindi natin gamitin na rin yon para sana, at palagay ko malaki may tutuloy sa ekonomiya yan dahil magkakaroon ng purchasing power din. Disbursement acceleration din yon. So, and that's why I'm saying na maganda rin na nadidebate itong mga bagay na to sa Kongreso. At tiyak walang mawawalang pera doon. Was that the comment already earlier? So thank you for that, Mr. Secretary, Mr. Chairman. Nabanggit natin at masabi ninyo, ibibigay ninyo sa amin yung detalye ng savings, no? Question, Secretary. Just for the record again, at para hindi lang masira yung trend of thought, ano? Paano sila naging savings? How were they declared as savings?
Well, there is a definition of savings in the GAA. And so on that basis, we use that as a basis for declaring them as savings.
Yes.
And then once we have determined the level of savings that we can consolidate, we go to the President. Because in all instances, the President has to approve the declaration and consolidation of savings. And then once na-determine yon, tsaka natin aalamin kung saan posibleng pwedeng gamitin yung savings.
Yes,
Mga savings.
I understand the procedure, Secretary. Meron akong nakita doon sa sinabitin niyo sa Supreme Court. I think partially this was asked earlier by Senator Nancy Binay as well, no? In respondents' fifth evidence packet, no? Hindi naman kahabaan ito. Nagulat lang ako dito sa sulat. So this is, I suppose, public record, no? At kanina nga pinag-uusapan namin ni Chairman din to. And this is what Senator Nancy brought out earlier, yung from the DOTC. Dear Secretary Abad, in compliance with the requirement of your office for the DOTC to submit a list of 2012 and 2013 projects for withdrawal, please find here with annexes A and B representing the financial plan for the withdrawal. Roughly dito 14.5 billion ang pinag-uusapan at this is dated June 19, 2013. I am familiar with the DOTC budget because I defended the budget every year in 2011, 12, and 13. No? And as Vice Chairman of the Appropriations or the Finance Committee in the Senate. At dito, it would appear to me, and that's why I want to ask this question so that to give you a chance to explain it, meron naman kasi ditong paragraph din dito eh. The DOTC will request for the release of corresponding funds when the contracts for such projects are about to be awarded. So para bang may escape clause naman. So I give you this opportunity to explain. No? But having said that, it would appear to me, this 2-year budget, mahigit 14 billion, yung halos yung buong capital outlay ng DOTC for these 2 years. So when we crafted the budget in Congress in 2012, which I defended for the DOTC, and in 2013, noong 2013, my impression was that ginagawa na yung mga project, ito mga airports, seaports, lighthouses, as we were tackling the budget in 2013. Nagulat na lang ako when we tried to get as much information possible tungkol nga dito sa kaso sa Supreme Court, itong DAP. And I came across this, na it would appear sinorender lahat. Airports, navigational facilities, 4.4 billion, lighthouses, ports, other improvements, LTFRB buildings, so on and so forth, Mr. Secretary. And during the deliberations here and in the floor deliberations, we told our members in the Senate na ito mga project na to, ganun kagaling ang DOTC na kaya, hindi na siya lump sum, naka-line item to mga to, maliwanag kung saan pupunta ang mga project na to. To find out na were all of these abandoned or are we now doing some of these projects already? Naibalik na ba yung pondo nila? Halimbawa.
Well, merong binigay na, kasi hindi naman namin ito ipipilit kung hindi papayag yung ahensya kasi they're normally very jealous of their
I understand
budgets.
that. That's why I'm surprised.
Minsan hindi pa sasabihin sa iyo na
Yes,
hindi
yes.
talaga kakayanin. But
Yes.
I think they were very honest enough to admit na
Yes.
there were certain problems insofar as the obligation of the allotments given to them. And let me give you some examples of this. For example, MOA with LGU for Calibo Airport, for site acquisition was still in the process. Or delays were incurred in the award of contract, horizontal, for the Bicol International Airport, halimbawa, due to the petition for mandamus filed by one of the bidders, currently procuring consultants for the redesigning of the terminal building, mga ganyan. Or halimbawa, sa LRT Line 2 extension, delay in the procurement of D&D consultant
yes.
pending resolution. So, may mga,
I'm
may
sure
mga
you have an
paliwanag.
explanation,
Yeah,
Secretary.
may mga paliwanag sila.
At nagulat lang ako, lahat ito, lahat may problema. Every single item.
To be honest, hindi ko talaga kabisado ang mga projects na yan. And
Yes.
I don't know if Secretary Abaya is still around to be able to shed light on each one of
Is
them.
some of them being constructed already today? I mean, yes.
Yeah, if we can, I'm pretty sure some, if not most, are already underway. But I think if we can recognize Secretary Abaya, Mr. Chairman, to
That is
explain.
good to hear if most are being constructed today. Could we have a list of these projects that are being constructed today in connection with what we have approved in 12 and 13? Secretary?
We'll submit, Your Honor. I
Pwede
don't
ba?
have the list down, but we'll gladly submit.
So, in effect, what you're saying is naibalik na rin partially, if at all.
Partially, Your Honor. In fact, we were indeed looking forward
Yes.
to procure all of this that were taken away. However, given the decision right now where unprogrammed funds couldn't be tapped, neither could we touch savings because we haven't ended the year yet. That's part of our frustration. So now we're programming it for 2015. Unless a supplemental budget comes out,
Yes.
that will support this.
You know, Secretary, I think these projects are very good projects. malaki ang may tutulong to sa ating ekonomiya. The multiplier effect, the competitiveness, the efficiency in logistic, transport, so on and so forth, no? And that's why we went through it with a fine tooth comb, no? And we were surprised when you submitted this in 12 and 13. It was very detailed, unlike in previous agreement, na laging lump sums, no? And that's why we were very happy with this. But it is just surprising to note that all of these projects, almost the entire capital outlay of the DOTC for 2 years, would in fact seem to be abandoned. I hope that we can correct this for either through a supplemental budget or for 2015, for at least the projects that are not being implemented. Sayang naman.
Yes, Your Honor. The Cabinet recently met to make the final presentation to the President, and we are confident that the big items that we're putting in, we do commit that we will have it procured and contracted out within the year of 2015.
Thank you, Secretary Abaya. Secretary Butch, are there any other of this type of projects, productive portions in the budget, na hindi natuloy?
There are, but not in this magnitude.
Okay.
Not in this magnitude.
That is reassuring, Secretary. Thank you very much for that. Let me move on, Secretary. We discussed sources. How did they become savings? This is one example. Another thing is yung tanong kanina ni Senator Angara, and let me follow up on that. Na yung, are there any new appropriations in the DAP? And I think your answer was no. That means every item, 117 of them, have an appropriations cover.
That's correct, Mr. Chair.
Just for clarification, Secretary, because it's the first time that we're going through this, for my knowledge, for my better understanding as well. I'll use one example mentioned by Senator Grace Poe earlier, and I'm glad that she brought this out. No? On item 31, DOF-BOC, to settle the principal obligations with PDIC consistent with the agreement with the CISS and SGS of 2.8 billion. No? The required funding shall cover the payment of obligations incurred by the Bureau of Customs to the PDIC in connection with the comprehensive import supervision scheme with the Societe Generale de Surveillance. Hindi ako nagkakamali, Secretary. Ito, tinanggal natin to. Sa Pilipinas, hindi na natin ginagamit itong mga taong ito. Since what year? When did we stop their contract with the BOC?
I cannot remember when exactly.
If I recall,
Mr. Chair.
somewhere 99?
Yes, but the entity still exists, and in fact, they're still one of the authorized surveyors for pre-shipment inspection. No? But at that time, they had an exclusive contract with the government of inspecting all incoming shipments. And we, if my memory serves me right, we accumulated a bill of, I think, 7 billion approximately. And part of that was covered by a letter of credit that had to be called on. And that ended up with PDIC.
Yes. So, ang tanong ko dito, bakit ito nasama doon sa 144 na total fund releases? Bakit ito sinama sa DAP na inaprubahan? Sana nakasama niya sa 167 na the difference between the 167 and 144 na hindi naaprubahan.
You know, you have to imagine when this was being discussed, this was towards the end part of the year, no? And there were discussions on which ones would most likely be disbursed immediately, no? Because if not, then that would be taken care of in the next budget. And then at the same time,
but nothing wrong with taking care in the next budget. Submit it to Congress. Let's debate it, if at all.
I'm getting to the point,
Yes,
Mr. Chair. we had fiscal space. And we wanted to make sure that the budget next year would not be unduly burdened. No? So an example was, say last year, at a certain point, our deficit was only about less than 1% of GDP when we were with a program of up to 2%. No? So it's pointless to keep it below 1% 1 year and then you move the other years beyond 2%.
I understand, Secretary.
So
I
that's
understand where you're
basically
coming
the
from.
reason, sir.
Yeah, but what I'm saying is this. Walang multiplier effect sa ekonomiya to. Itong pagbayad sa SGS o sa PDIC ng utang ng custom sa SGS, kung meron man ng 2.8 billion. Meaning to say, paano to nakatulong sa ating ekonomiya? How many jobs were created by this, if at all any?
Important thing to point out, Mr. Chair, is that it did not displace any item. No, there was space. Now, when we were discussing this, this included a bigger item, the equity contribution to the central bank, which is
I will get to that. I will get to that,
similar
Secretary.
nature. When we were discussing this, no, we had extra space. And we couldn't find any other agency that had the capability to accelerate disbursement. No? So we said, well, we have extra space, why don't we clean up? And that was my point earlier. The BSP is a cleanup because this was authorized in 1993. 50 billion, only 10 was paid since then. And it was only the Aquino administration that completed the balance of the 50. So since we had space, and no agency, we were not displacing anything, then we put it in.
Secretary, precisely the point, we have a deliberative body as well. Many of the projects here in the DAP, okay sa akin eh. Assuming you brought that to Congress, many of these would have been approved. Walang problema. The way I see it, personal opinion, okay? I would have had problems paying this amount to PDIC. Especially knowing that hindi dumaan in a deliberative process. At least, I'm sure, napag-usapan ninyo, but, ang pagkaintindi ko sa DAP, dapat, is quick disbursement, inclusive growth, makatulong in creating jobs, so on and so forth. No? I don't think this 2.8 billion nakatulong in any way sa paglago ng ating ekonomiya, in any job that was created. But I understand where you're coming from, no? For all we know, if you submitted this in the budget the following year, and based on your credibility, we would have agreed anyway. Di ba? At may fiscal space naman tayo. That's all I just wanted to point out, no? Sayang naman. So, but my main point here is, what is the appropriations cover for this? It must be in the unprogrammed fund, I suppose, if there is any.
No, it has a particular PAP to which it can be referred to, and it's even it has a code, capital A, period, capital I, period, small letter A, period, number 1, and that is examination and appraisal of imports for the proper imposition of duties and taxes, including assistance in the tax collection system established under etc. etc.
This was not in the unprogrammed fund?
No, this is it's an augmentation of an existing
budget
item. In the GAA of Republic Act 10-147, page 430.
So in the program portion?
Yes. So we augmented an existing item in the program portion.
And you gave it to whom? BOC?
No, PDIC. We gave it to BOC to pay PDIC. Yes.
So hindi na rin quick disbursement yon. Dumana naman sa isa pang ahensya. BOC, babayaran naman sa... Bakit di na lang yun dinerecho sa PDIC?
Ano pala siya? Utang siya ng BOC.
Okay.
Hindi siya utang ng national government. So,
But this utang of the BOC was guaranteed, I suppose, by the national government, right?
By PNB. PNB.
Yeah, which then was owned by the government.
Yes, sir.
Oh, sige, let me move to another point. Interrelated, okay, to find out what is the appropriations cover. Okay? Yung Bangko Sentral, for the last 3 years, 30 billion ang binigay nyo. Not that I am against funding the capitalization of the Bangko Sentral. Okay? But I do not see the logic of how that spending of 30 billion to the Bangko Sentral would have increased economic activity, create jobs in the process, and ensure inclusive growth.
Well, sir, the financial health of the Bangko Sentral is crucial to the financial integrity of the Republic. Its ability to monitor the banking system and to manage the macroeconomic environment is at the heart of determining our our credit. No? And as a result of our improved management in these areas of our institutions, we've been able to improve our ratings, which has resulted to lower interest rates, not only for the country, but also for the companies and to the consumers.
Yes, Secretary said,
And that
you're
leads to-
saying that all of this is because of the 30 billion you gave to the central bank?
Well, not necessarily, sir, but
Not
it is part of
necessarily, yes.
just like in cooking a dish, there are many ingredients, no? So, and this is one of the ingredients that's crucial, no? And in fact, BSP has a proposal right now under the new BSP proposed charter to increase it further to 200 billion. And they believe that given the increase in size of the economy, they need a bigger capitalization. And that was the logic for this, sir. We actually put in 40, 30 under DAP and 10 under JA to complete the 50
Pero ang
billion.
tanong doon kasi ganito, Secretary, bakit hindi 15 na lang muna? Bakit 30 ka agad? O bakit hindi GIS? And then we could have used that money to maraming health enhancement, more scholarships. I mean, that is precisely the point, no?
As I mentioned, Mr. Chair, earlier, we did not displace any project. This amount was actually probably the last that we put in when we realized that there were no other projects that we could push. In fact, if we wanted more projects, we could have, because if you look at the deficit of the country the past 3 years, it was well within the 2% ceiling that we imposed on ourselves. In fact, last year, it was only 1.3% of GDP. We could have put in 0.7%, which is approximately 70 to 80 billion pesos of projects, but we couldn't. So we did not displace any.
Yes, but the question is, could we have spent it better to make sure that the economy grow at a faster rate? That's the point. And how many jobs could be created? Remember, the problem today also, poverty incidence, unemployment, underemployment, so on and so forth. I mean, marami kasing pwedeng paggastusan. That's the point, no? So the issue is, I may trust the Aquino administration, but if we allow this to continuously happen, maybe in a future administration, di ba, na masama ang isip at pagwaldas ang iniisip, delikado tayo dyan. And that's why there are statutes and processes. Di ba? Remember, this is not a private enterprise. Hindi naman to pribadong kumpanya na board of directors gagawa ng budget. Walang statute yun. People's money ito ang pinag-uusapan Ha? That is the point, Secretary. No? Malaking tiwala ko at tiwala ng mamamayan sa ating Pangulo and to many of the cabinet officials. No? Ngunit, nababahala ako sa ganitong klaseng walang perang nawala dito. Let me point that out naman para mabuting maliwanag. Wala naman perang nawala dito sa 30 billion. Nasa central bank yan eh. Although the point is, hindi natin pera to eh. Pera ng taong bayan to eh. Ha? So madali tayo magdesisyon na ibigay natin sa central bank yan. Maganda nga yung sinabi nyo kanina, Secretary. There is a bill here in Congress. I filed one of them amending the charter of the central bank. You are proposing itaas natin yung capitalization to 200 billion. 200 billion. Dagdag 150 ulit. Saan ba manggagaling yun? Manggagaling sa buwis yun eh. Tama? Okay. But yan at least dito, mapagdedebatihan natin. And then maybe we can agree later on, 100 lang. O baka tama lang yung 50 na. Diba? That's the point. Okay? So I will not belabor that issue anymore. No? I understand naman where you're coming from. Yes, Secretary RC, you wanted to say something?
Yes, Your Honor. I just wanted to add a little bit here. I think that learning from our history and experiences in the recent decades, Your Honor, the health of the economy, particularly the macroeconomic fundamentals, assuming that this money has contributed to making the Bangko Sentral healthier and therefore are able to provide a better macroeconomic environment in the form of being able to manage the exchange rate, the interest rate, prices, price levels. These tend to have far ranging impact.
Secretary, I agree. I understand the role of the central bank. I was in your seat before the DBCC working also with...
No, I just wanted to make to state, Your Honor, that even though you don't impact directly on the poor through this spending, the indirect
Secretary,
effects are...
without giving the 30 billion, they were doing fine, as far as I'm concerned. They were doing pretty well in
Mr.
managing
Chair?
as an institution. Yes.
May I just interject? It's 40 billion. It's 10 plus 30. It was given in 2 tranches. Am I correct? Yes, it's 40.
Mr.
Yes.
Chair,
But under the DAP, I think 30 lang na nabigay.
under the DAP, 20 plus 10, then there was
30.
10 under the GAA, Mr.
Yeah.
Chair.
Yes.
So
Yes.
the increase was 4.
Yes.
The total increase
Yes.
was 40.
Okay, thank you. So, fully capitalized na? Okay. So, I just wanted to put on record, Secretary RC, no, that I understand the role of the central bank. And they were doing just fine as well. As an institution, they were doing their job, and I credit them for many of the good things that is happening to our macroeconomy as well, no? And their managing of the financial situation or financial institutions in the country, no? So thank you for that interjection, Secretary RC. Let me move on, Secretary Butch, to unprogrammed funds. Oh, before I get to that, what was the appropriations cover nga pala for this 30 billion? Just to set the record straight.
The item that was augmented was budgetary support to GOCCs.
The budgetary support is in the unprogrammed fund.
No, it's in the regular...
So it's in the program fund?
Yes.
Magkano ba ang total ng budget ng program fund?
Well...
I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Magkano yung budgetary support to GOCCs in the program fund?
Mga kasama kasi dito, the subsidies we give to NIA, to National Electrification Administration, to Philippine Fisheries Development Authority,
So all
Cultural
of that
Center.
is in one? Or naka-line up? Budgetary
Meron
support
siyang
to
parang
GOCC?
meron siyang parang
Heading?
heading tapos meron mga maliliit doon.
NIA, ganon-ganon, di ba? Okay. Wala ako natatanda may central bank doon.
Meron no sa dulo yung others.
Others.
Oo, meron others. Doon pumasok ko yung...
Okay, so Secretary, magkano yung total nun?
What year are we talking about?
Let's start with 11 muna. Sige. Oh. Kahit na 1 year lang, 11, 12, 13, para hindi na tayo, we do not belabor the issue. Any year lang.
Sa 2013, Mr. Chairman, ang total subsidies of GOCCs is 42 billion.
Okay, and then, let's say for the entire, under that heading, pero specific yung iba specific, ito others lang
Halimbawa sa 2012, budgetary support to government corporations, others, ang total ho is 13.6 billion.
Okay, I'll just make a point, Secretary. 13.6 billion was the total universe for that year for assistance to GOCCs. And I suppose in
Billion.
Billion nga. And I suppose in that year you added 10 billion one time under others as an appropriations cover, right? Okay. In effect, parang 100% increase yun. From 13 plus 10, 23. Is that correct?
Almost, yes, sir.
Okay. So parang there's something wrong there naman, di ba? Number one, nasa others. And then two, it's almost 100% increase of what was appropriated by Congress. Of course, I understand where you are coming from. You have the administrative code and you have the power to augment. Naintindihan ko yun. Based on that, I don't think it's illegal. Okay? Now, my point lang is, parang hindi transparent ata yung pagkagawa nun. Na walang pahintulot galing sa Kongreso. Hindi maliwanag. Sana linagay man lang ninyo o 1 million sa Central Bank and we can augment that. At least alam namin na, meron appropriations cover dito. Posibleng lagyan itong amount na, no? Something like that, Secretary. Any comments on that?
Well, it's really the benefit of hindsight.
Yes. Thank you for your very candid answer, Secretary. Yes.
With the permission of Senator Recto, I saw the item you were mentioning, 13.6 billion, Secretary, rest of GOCCs. But that item is MOE. Can you augment that item na MOE and use it to capitalize the Bangko Sentral?
Well, under that Supreme Court ruling, what is really critical is the existence of an item of appropriations. In this instance, it is the budgetary support to government corporations, and it is not the allotment class that we should be looking at, which is really the PSMOE capital outlay.
I agree, but as a rule, previous practice of the DBM, even previous practice of other departments, di ba? Nag-augment sila, MOE from MOE, CO to CO, PS to PS.
No, on the experience of the staff, what they really look for is the item. The item, Mr. Chair.
So kahit na MOE yung item at CO yung gagastusan nyo, basta yung kumpanya, yung corporation, yung project, nandun, okay lang yan.
Pwede ho yan. Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just one comment on this issue, Secretary. Aside from the other comment I already made, no? But from what I recall, when I was a congressman during the time of President Ramos, when I started studying these budgetary issues, nung araw, ang mga realignment na natatandaan ko, PS to PS, MOE to MOE, capital outlay to capital outlay. Nagbago na ba yan through the years from what was the original practice then? From one window to the same window? Parang ganun yung natatandaan ko nung araw kasi. You may have an answer now, and just in case you do not, you can just submit it to the committee.
You may be you may be thinking about realignments. Because there are rules about realignments from
yes.
allotment classes. Like, for
Yes.
example,
Yes.
if it's a realignment, normally we don't allow realignments of MOE and capital outlay into PS, for example.
Correct.
So that you may be referring to that, Mr. Chairman.
Yeah. But what is the essence of this augmentation? Hindi ba similar din yan sa realignment? I mean, at the local level, my wife has become mayor, has become governor. And the only difference there is that every time we seek for a realignment, there are two types of realignment. One is you declare it savings and you realign it for another purpose.
You're correct there, Mr. Chairman.
Yes.
There are realignments that do not require you to declare them as savings. For example, it's a farm-to-market road to another farm-to-market road. You can do that, and in fact, the agencies do not have to go to us for clearance.
Correct.
But if it requires declaration of savings so that you can augment it, we have to go to the president for clearance.
Correct. That's why I'm saying kanina MOE to MOE, capital outlay to capital outlay, so on and so forth. No? Okay. Just a few more items. No? Yung unprogrammed fund. Okay. I heard what you discussed earlier with Secretary Gingon. I didn't want to interject dahil masisira yung flow of thought and so on and so forth. But, and I've read from the documents submitted to the committee and the motion for reconsideration filed with the Supreme Court that your interpretation of revenues is not the entire, for the reasons you already mentioned earlier, okay? In total revenues. And it is specific to a single revenue source. Okay? Is that good fiscal policy management, Secretary Butch? Tama ba yun? I'll give you an example, Secretary. Let's say sin taxes, tumaas ang collection by 10 billion. And therefore, you claim na you can already spend for unprogrammed funds. Example lang to. But then, your Bureau of Customs decreased by 50 billion. But you already spent the unprogrammed fund. So that is, you can get a higher deficit by doing that. Diba? I mean, I know that in your case, with the Pinoy administration, you have not surpassed the deficits that you have programmed. I understand that. We watch it every year. I'm saying that nakakatakot lang that definition if it were to be used by other administrations. It can be abused. That is the point I just wanted to make, Secretary.
Well, in fact, that's a consideration. In fact, it's an important consideration. That's why one of the documents that the Constitution requires us to submit to you is a budget of expenditures and sources of financing.
Right.
Because that will determine how are you going to finance the program appropriations.
Correct.
So we will have to say how much revenues are we going to generate, and then how much financing are we going to get, And so
that's in the BSEF.
That's in the BSEF. And the total of that should equal your program appropriations. So you cannot use these revenue sources, that is program to finance your program appropriations, to fund your unprogrammed appropriations. That is why it is required that you either exceed your program revenue collections, or you find a new source of revenue that is not contemplated in your program revenues, or you generate it from proceeds from perfected loan agreements. So it's really borrowing. So the impact on the deficit is not going to happen
correct.
because you preserve your sources of financing.
Yeah, but remember the example I gave earlier, Secretary. To me, it does not seem to be a good fiscal management. Ulitin ko lang yung nabanggit ko kanina. Let's say, okay, on one source of revenue, I hit my target and surpass it by 10 billion. But in another source of revenue, example lang, Bureau of Customs, below target ako, below last year ako, 50 billion na yung drop ko. Lugi ka pa ng 40. Pag ginastos ko to sa program, assuming you spent the budget, di ba? That's the point I'm just trying to drive at. Alam ko kayo, binabantayan ninyo yung deficit. I give that to you already. But that interpretation can be abused by another administration. That's just my point, Secretary. So, ang akin lang is, pag-isipan niyo na mabuti itong posisyon ninyo dyan. But I understand where you're coming from. Alam ko naman responsable kayo eh, not to blow out the deficit. And the record will show over the past few years that you did not. So I just wanted to put that on record as well. No? Okay. And then, and because of some of the examples I raised earlier, that's why it is important. Congress is the deliberative body. I understand, Secretary, once you're familiar with all of this, Secretary, you came from the House of Representatives, di ba? Okay.
But it's different from the Congress side as against
I'm going to get that.
Yeah.
I'm going to get to that. Okay. Nagkasama tayo sa Kongreso, sa Senado, and I don't blame you. The President came from the House, the Senate, and is now President. Depending where you sit, I understand that, Secretary. You wear a different hat, you sit in a different saddle. And of course, if you're President, you want to do certain things. In the case of the President, I'm sure nagmamadali din siya. He wants to accomplish much, just like many of us want to accomplish much, di ba? Di balay ko yung DAP ay 40, 50 billion, maybe, pwede pa siguro. Pero, yung daan-daan billion, nagugulat ang tao. Yun lang ang gusto kong idagdag sa pag-uusap na to. And remember, Secretary, just last 2 points, before I give the floor to the Chairman and for Senator Osmeña. No? Assuming maganda tong administrative code na to, which is the basis for all the powers given to the President to augment items in the budget, declare savings. Theoretically, the entire budget, he can declare savings with the exception of the PS, yung talaga nagastos na, di ba? Yung tinatira, yung savings yun, yung, what do you call this, what are the limitations, no? In effect, halos the entire productive portion of the budget, you can turn around. If we are talking here of 170 billion, another president can make it, the entire productive portion of the budget. Kasi walang limitations dun eh. Okay? Now, having said that, and I understand that the administrative code provides for the flexibility. Diba? Okay? Kung magaling na maganda itong administrative code na to, and it gives the executive that flexibility, would you recommend that we do that for all local government units as well? Meaning to say, kung ako mayor ako governor ako, nakita ko may savings dito, hindi ko na kailangan ipaalam sa sangguniang pambayan, panlalawigan. On my own, I can create my own, ano yung pangalan dati? Reserve Control Account. Gagawa ko na sarili kong acronym. Would you recommend that we do this for all local government units? Amend the local government code and bigyan natin ng kapangyarihan para mas mabilis na rin yung serbisyo may bibigay sa tao?
Well, while, theoretically, we can say that we can conceive of it, But there are other considerations that come into play, say political, because some of these projects are projects that are being continued through the years. For example, you need to build classrooms to meet your classroom requirements. You need to build hospitals or maintain hospitals. So it is really not possible, although theoretically it's possible, but politically it's going to be difficult for, unless you did what the previous administration did, which is really allow the budget to be reenacted, almost for the whole year. But that's a disaster for
Correct. And
expenditure
I agree with you.
management.
I'm totally with you on that issue, Secretary.
So, but that is not to say that it can. That is not to say that
So
it
in
can.
effect,
It is not prone
Secretary,
to abuse.
yes.
It can be prone to
It
abuse,
can
but
be
not.
prone to-
But not in the magnitude that you fear that can happen.
Theoretically, it is, di ba?
Yeah,
Okay,
theoretically.
now, if it is so good, the administrative code, like I said nga, and I will not belabor the point, would you recommend that for the local government as an amendment in the local government code? Magkaroon din ang mga mayor, governor ng their own administrative code in that sense?
Well,
That they
the
have
local
all this flexibility as well?
the local government units do not have to deal with the complexity of governance of a president who is the chief executive officer of the country. So I may be reluctant to do that.
Good answer,
insofar as,
Secretary. Thank you very much. One final point, Secretary. What is the reason kaya for why do you think the Supreme Court frowns on cross-border subsidies? Just to enrich the record.
Well, I think
Anong dahilan kaya, no?
the underlying reason is the principle of separation of powers and to therefore protect the autonomy and independence of the different branches of government so that they can effectively and meaningfully exercise check and balance over each other. I think that's essentially what
Essentially.
yeah.
Okay. So essentially, what it is really is, as you have pointed out as well, Secretary, na parang pagka napapaboran mo yung other constitutional bodies o di kaya other branches of government, nawawala ang independence. That's basically it. Is that correct, Secretary? Parang ganun eh.
Well, that will happen. For example, if it becomes a practice. But in our particular case, they have been extraordinary and at the instance of the receiving agency. It's not a unilateral imposition on the part of the executive to force the other branch to receive funds. It's really upon the request because of an extraordinary circumstance. In fact, it only happened once. And so
And
if
the
the agency is willing to...
And the careful balance there now is that interdependence vis-a-vis this.
That's correct.
Diba?
Yes.
Okay. But like I said, no, it's nawawala yung independence din kasi kung papaboran mo at bibigyan mo ng pondo one branch of government at malaki, if you want to abuse it, it can be abused. And that's why it is necessary to have laws to ensure that one is not stronger than the other, so on and so forth, di ba?
Well, one good example is the example pointed out by the chairman early on, when regularly judges receive allowances from mayors. That one is something that may be problematic.
No, let me explain that to you, Secretary. The difference is, at the local level, there is an appropriations. It is passed by the Sanggunian. That is a difference. There is a clear appropriations cover. There's a clear intent na may appropriations cover. Just like when we pass the budget of COMELEC, COA, may appropriations cover. It is after the fact na may problema, if at all.
The risk remains that the independence and the autonomy of that branch of government is imperiled by the fact that it regularly receives subsidy from the local government. I'm not saying it does happen.
I understand, yeah.
But talking about this principle that you've raised.
Yes. Thank you, Secretary. Thank you to the chairman and to our colleagues for your patience. Maraming salamat, Secretary.
Thank you, Senator Recto. Just a small interjection on that. I agree with Secretary Abad on that point. It's the national government that funds Congress that funds the judiciary and all the courts down the line. The local government does not have any business really, unless they really want to help. And I believe that their motives they're good intentioned. But there are some questions that can be raised given this cross-border decision of the court. If it extends up to that situation, wherein local government units actually allocate monies, in a way cross-border, to the judiciary, given that they are in the executive, even if it's appropriated. Senator Espeña, sir? Magandang hapon na po, after 6 hours.
At magandang gabi po sa inyong lahat. Yes, I pity the cabinet members who are here today, and I appreciate their presence. To recap, Secretary Abad, because we would have to repeat some of the questions that had been asked earlier by other members of the Senate in order to keep a trend of thought. The need for DAP was started in 2011, ostensibly to make adjustments in a budget that you merely inherited, actually, which was presented to the Senate or to Congress in 2010, the latter part, and enacted into law.
Including certain practices in the disbursement of funds. That's why we say it's broader than really spending reforms. It's broader than that, but it's a package of those budgetary changes.
Yes, I have praised you for the introduction, even several years ago, of new management practices in the DBM and in the disbursement of the budget. Now, I just wanted to know, as a point, from the point of view of policy, would this reformation of some past administrations' budget hold for future administrations? We do tend to change the president every 6 years now. So would the succeeding administration now, if the Supreme Court allowed you to get away with what you did, would it now have to tolerate a succeeding administration also doing the same thing?
As far as the practices that we do in expenditure management, we feel that these are in order, and therefore, if a succeeding administration continues with the practice, which are really underlined by transparency and accountability and greater efficiency, certainly.
Right. I understand you still have an MR there, so you'll have to stay with your position. Now, earlier you mentioned, you stated that the total savings or sources of funds, to be more accurate, which were generated for DAP amounted to about 237 B.
That's correct, Mr. Chair.
Right. And that the proposed projects or the application of funds would have been about 167 B, and of that 144 billion was released.
That's correct, Mr. Chairman.
What happened to the balance of 93 billion?
The balance may have been likely used, as was earlier pointed out, to fund to augment some other items that initially were not regarded as priority and therefore included in the
no, but that would be more exact now. You would have an exact breakdown of that, because we're just talking about numbers. And
yes, and it's possible
your computers would have that.
Yes, and it's possible that the others may just have been used to. If you notice, for example, last year, as pointed out by Secretary Purisima, our deficit to GDP ratio went down to 1.3%. So that means a lot of the funds were not used, Mr. Chairman.
Okay.
About 0.7% of 2 trillion, that's about 140 billion, Mr. Chairman.
Now, in case of new programs, or what you call proposed expenditures, who makes those proposals? In other words, who creates the new budget items in the absence of the participation of the normal people who do it.
It's really drawn from the proposals coming from mainly the national agencies, whether they are national government agencies
So
or
in the middle of the
GOCCs.
year, they feel free to come up to you and say, Mr. Secretary, we need more money for this, we need more money for that. We understand that's an ongoing thing, no?
Yes, that's correct, Mr. Chair.
All right. Now, who vets those projects?
Well, usually, for
Let me
example,
just explain a little bit so that the record will reflect it. There's a proposal. I need 5 billion pesos for more classrooms in Bulacan. That's fine. There's nothing wrong with such a proposal. It's very normal. But normally there's a vetting process, which is Congress. Now, who vets that in the absence if you're going back to Congress for authorization to spend?
quite a number of the proposals come from the different clusters that we organize ourselves.
That's the cabinet cluster.
In the cabinet. For example, there's a cluster for human development, there's a cluster for economic management, and a cluster for good governance, climate change, and security and peace. So they meet regularly and they propose projects. Mr. Chair.
Now, who vets it? Who criticizes it? Who asks why not this instead of that? Which is what we do here in Congress, as you know, when it comes to the budget debates.
Well, amongst themselves, because they also have proposals that they want to be
So
included in the
they
list.
propose and they approve.
Yes, and they vet because not all could be accommodated. And then it goes to the Department of Budget and Management. We vet it not so much for the substantive because we trust the clusters to be able to do that, but we vet it in terms of, is there a budget cover for this in the GAA to justify the augmentation, things like that. Is the amount reasonable? We look at the program of work. Is are the cost assumptions
We're looking at
realistic?
the details.
Yes, yes.
All right. Now, in Congress, we tend to look at first the budget as a whole, and which is why our first few meetings is with the DBCC, the Development Budget Coordinating Committee. We'll look at your assumptions, we'll question them, we'll test them, we'll challenge them, then we'll go to the application of funds. So, in this sense, do you have the same type of process when you approve projects or when you decide to fund projects that have not been approved by Congress?
Well, the DBCC looks at it more from point of, complying with certain macroeconomic assumptions like deficit, things like that. And of course, the clusters would look at it more substantially in terms of, are these aligned to the priorities of this cluster, for example, poverty reduction? And we looked at it more from the expenditure side. And then eventually, after we all go through that, we make recommendations to the President who looks at it from practically any angle that he wants. And the President is very rigorous in reviewing the budget.
All right. Now, I agreed with you earlier when you said the DAP, or the concept of the DAP, not the actual sources and applications, some of which have been questioned by the Supreme Court. But the DAP itself gives you more flexibility, more elbow room. And you did complain earlier about the rigid parameters that the budget process subjects you to. But unfortunately, that's our constitutional process. We've tried to find ways to soften it up and cooperate with the executive over the years, but there are certain things that the Constitution mandates that we are supposed to do and that you are supposed to respect. In other words, we have the power of the purse. So, in other words, when you start realigning things without getting approval of Congress, or you start funding new projects and new programs and activities without so much as a by your leave from Congress, talagang labag sa Constitution yan. Would you agree?
Not entirely, with all due respect, Mr. Chairman, because, for example, in the case of unprogrammed appropriation, you actually authorize us to have standby appropriations. And you approve the budget, and the budget carries that. So we really don't violate the Constitution. Now, in the case of realignments, you define savings in the GAA, and that sort of gives us parameters when we can in fact declare savings. So
I agree.
We can argue that it's not a violation of
There's
the
a little elbow room there, but where there's no elbow room is when you start funding programs that are not itemized in the General Appropriations Act. So sometimes we'll just give you a general nomenclature for something where you can use also as another wastebasket and say, oh, dito galing yan, or we can put this program under this particular name, and it will pass scrutiny. So yeah, there is some give and take there, no? But I think by and large, the GAA has to pass, and it's in the Constitution that if no appropriation shall be made for an item that is not included and passed by Congress.
Well, that certainly is very clear. If there is no item, then there is nothing to augment, Mr. Chairman. So therefore, you're correct there.
Now, run us generally through the budget approval process. In the first 3 months of the previous year, the departments start preparing their individual budgets, their wish list, probably double what they got the year before. Am I correct?
Yes, sometime towards the latter part of, for example, this year, towards the latter part of 2013 and early 2014, we issue a budget call. And this is really a signal to the agencies to begin preparing your budgets. And for the first time, we have also issued a budget priorities framework that should guide the agencies in determining, what programs, activities, and projects should be contained in their budget proposals.
All right. And then in the second quarter, these budgets are submitted to the DBM, and that's when you start cutting them down to size and taking a look at the big picture.
Yeah, we begin what is called the technical budget hearings, where we invite the agencies to explain, why are you asking this much? Where is it going? And the added complication now is they have to show us what are the outputs and outcomes and the performance indicators that will show us that they have been able to achieve the outcomes. So they have to, for the money that they're going to get, what are you going to deliver? That's basically the question.
All right. Then, around the middle of the year, at the SONA, formally or informally, you pass the budget on to Congress for debate and approval.
Yes, we call the budget authorization phase.
In the past, a loophole had been utilized by the past administration for several years, I think 3 years. They made sure the budget wouldn't pass Congress by December 31st. Ergo, on this January 1, they could declare how many percent? 33% of the budget as savings.
Well, it was not just 3 times. Every year, in the almost 10 years, the budget was reenacted. And for 3 years, the whole budget was reenacted.
Okay, do we have a record of where they applied those? The budget was eventually enacted, di ba? But it was already approved in
January.
3
years, it was
February.
So, in 3 years, it was just fully reenacted.
All right. Do you have a record of where they moved around at 30% of the budget in those 3 years? In other words, they themselves made the proposal, they themselves wrote the items, and they themselves decided how much each item would get and approved it. That's what happens when you have a reenacted budget.
Well, what happens is usually the non-recurring items in the budget that are completed in that year, the amounts, the appropriations available there are just simply reenacted, but there is no program then that is going to be funded.
So
by
it becomes
those funds.
savings.
It becomes a huge savings, Mr.
On
Chairman.
January 1, January 2,
Yeah,
for official
for,
working through.
for every month that passes that the budget is not approved,
Yeah.
then more and more of the previous budget gets reenacted, Mr. Chairman.
Correct. Can we have a copy of where those monies, you don't have to submit it right away. Maybe in the next 2 months, you can have your computers just tell us where all those monies were spent. So we'd like to be able to have a historical record of
Yes, we will try to get you that, Mr. Chairman.
such abuses, no? Now, to reiterate, I think it was our chair, Senator Cheese, who requested you. There were specific items that the Supreme Court said, labag sa konstitusyon nito, you declared these items as savings when they were not yet qualified to be declared savings. We'd like to have a list of that one by one, and then after, corollary to that, on the application of funds, the Supreme Court also said that there were some expenditures that were made for items not included in the GAA, aside from the cross-border transfers. May we have also a list of those?
On the first point, we do have that list and we can submit that to you. On the point about certain augmentations not having items of appropriations to augment, that's where we differ with the Supreme Court, because we do have in this list, we can show you the,
So
the
everything
account code,
was to an existing
the item, as well as the
GAA
page in the
item.
GAA that was augmented, Mr. Chairman.
All right. So you don't know what the Supreme Court was talking about in that.
In fact, as was
latter
pointed
thing.
out earlier by, I think it was, I don't know if it's, I think it's Senator Gingona, that, for example, there was a confusion about, you know, what is required under the Constitution. Is it an item of appropriation or simply an allotment class?
Allocation class.
Yeah, allotment class. Yeah. So it's clear from the jurisprudence that it's really an item of appropriation that should exist and not so much the allotment class, Mr. Chair.
All right. And I guess you're going to clear the Supreme Court's mind on that.
I hope so, Mr. Chairman.
There are specific items that were raised by various parties, and I'd like to bring them up here and ask for specific information on them. One, the increase in the capitalization of the BSP, I don't, of course I won't object to that, but they do have a request, as Secretary Purisima said, to bring it up several fold to 200 billion pesos. And if possible, they'd want it as soon as possible. They'd want it right away. Now, what is Secretary Purisima's position on that request?
Mr. Chair, Senator, we support the idea of increasing capitalization. Although in one of the versions of the bill, they want it paid in equal tranches over 3 years, if I'm not mistaken. I believe that the administration would have to be given more flexibility because of fiscal concerns. But my thinking is that it should be over a limited period of time, rather than what happened in the past, where it was open-ended.
Yes, I told them, pay when able. So you better lobby than future administrations for it. I mean, just like what happened now. I mean, how long did it take to pay up? 22 years. So it went from 10 billion to 50 billion almost immediately. So I think they frowned on that. Of course, they'd like the money immediately, but they don't need it for operations because they can print money. I guess it's just more like window dressing and the prestige of having a higher capitalized central bank. And I do tend to agree with them if there's money available. So you have 93 billion available, maybe you can put it in the Banco Central, then borrow money again from them in return. Secondly, earlier, Mr. Secretary Abad, we did, by earlier I meant during the budget process, there was this item called BUB, bottom-up budgeting, which was, I think, imposed on many departments because the secretary didn't know what it was for. Where is BUB? Is that a DAP-funded project or?
No, it's in the GAA, Mr. Chairman.
Okay.
It's a GAA-funded project.
All right. What would the BUB amount to in the proposed budget for next year?
It's about 23 billion covering more than 1,600 municipalities and cities.
Why only 1,600? There's 1,700 something.
We cover all
The
the
others are not Liberal Party.
no. We cover all the municipalities and some cities because we give priority to poor areas, and there are categories that we use to.
That was my next
qualify them.
question. Why are you bothering to fund the cities when it's the 4th, 5th, and 6th class municipalities that would really benefit from this?
There are three categories of locations where we actually implement these programs. One, the first are in areas where the poverty incidence is high. So, the places like Zamboanga del Norte or places in Caraga. But there are also areas where the poverty incidence is low, but the magnitude of poor people is huge, like cities. They have huge slum areas. Yes. And the last category are geohazard areas or areas prone to, calamities.
Now, this is decided by which department?
Well, there is a task force.
Because this is spread out among several departments.
Yes, depending on the project. But usually these are social services and local infra projects. And there is an executive committee composed of myself, the Department of Social Welfare and Development, the Department of Interior for the local government.
What about the National Anti-Poverty Council?
And NAPSI is
and the Urban Poor Security.
Yeah, NAPSI co-chairs it with the Department of Social Welfare and Development, Mr. Chairman.
All right. And you expect this to be in the same magnitude next year, about 20 billion?
Yeah, well, it's 20 billion this year, and it will be about 23 billion next year because now we cover more localities.
Another item that puzzles me is you did have funding for sitio electrification in the amount of not very impressive amount, 1.3 or 2.3 billion in the DAP.
We did have, in fact, in two instances, it's 1.264 billion, Mr. Chairman.
Total?
Yes.
All right. Why did you fund that from the DAP when there is the Malampaya Fund, which is for energy development?
Well, in the case of, actually DAP is an automatic appropriation. So anytime you can actually use DAP, the Malampaya.
So was this sourced from Malampaya?
No, it's a source
why would
from.
you include it in the DAP when there's no savings involved? I understand the DAP. The sources of funds in the DAP are mostly from savings, no?
That's correct, Mr. Chairman. Yeah.
Would Malampaya funds be included in DAP?
No, Mr. Chairman,
Alright.
because it's.
So why did you not fund the sitio electrification?
Actually, at one point we did fund sitio electrification using the Malampaya Fund. But I think in this instance, since the National Electrification Administration, our target is about 36,000 sitios and barangays. Hopefully by the end of, these are the total number of sitios and barangays that need energization. And we were trying to invest 7 billion a year so that by the end of the president's term, we would have covered all the 36,000 sitios and barangays. But there was a point where I think the NEA was able to accelerate the implementation of the program so that they had a slack that could be filled so that they could actually energize more sitios. And I think that's the reason why it was given additional funding, Mr. Chairman.
But, Mr. Secretary, I'm sorry I left the numbers upstairs. It seems that we still have about 20% of our total sitios not yet energized.
Well, hopefully over the next 3
that
years.
was 25% 3 years or 4 years ago. That was, it's like...
Well, we can
going at
submit
a
the report to you,
crawl.
Mr. Chair, because we have substantially covered, I think, about 20,000 of the 33,000 sitios, Mr. Chairman, and barangays.
Just give me a percentage. How many percent of our barangays is still not energized?
Well, when we started, about 33,000 sitios. I don't know how many barangays are that. And 3,000 barangays, what they needed was, the improvement of their distribution lines in these barangays. So that was the number we started with, based on the report of NEA.
I
Mr.
think that's
Chairman.
because they always think that they have to hardwire it. When actually, an in-between solution like solar power would help a lot. Because
Yeah.
kung medyo malayo, it's really too expensive.
Yeah, there are quite a number of sitios because the minimum number that we require for a sitio electrification program to be initiated is there should at least be 100 houses that can be energized. If it's below that number,
That's right.
it's better to use renewable energy systems for those areas because it's not cost effective to do so.
Yeah, well, this we will take up in our Energy Committee hearings, but we're really concerned that up to now, we've got something like at least 20% of households not yet energized. Now, that was 30% in 2007. So that's not much of an improvement, no? Given that we do have the funds for it.
Yes, sir.
It can be sourced from the Malampaya Fund. Lastly, because all the questions have been asked, I'd just like you to submit to the committee a breakdown of the collections and the application of funds from the Malampaya pool. Because I think there's a large amount there that has not been spent. And perhaps Congress can amend the law that authorized the pooling of Malampaya royalties so that it may be applied in other areas of the energy sector.
We will do that, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I thank all the secretaries for having stayed for 4 hours. No, 7 hours.
Nearly 7 hours. Thank you, Senator Esmeña. Thank you, Secretary Abad. We would also like to thank Secretaries Purisima and Balisacan, as well as the other secretaries here present. May we just remind the DBM and the Secretariat will be reminding and following up, Mr. Secretary, the submissions that was asked for by the members earlier, as well as what you're holding right now, which we will make public as well, in addition to you publishing it in your website. We'd also like to thank for staying with us the secretaries that are still here, namely Secretaries Rojas, Paje, Singson, Ona, De Los Reyes, Abaya, Pangilinan, of course, Secretary Matt, Secretary Mar rather, and Secretary Domingo. Thank you for staying with us, and thank you for supporting your colleague in the cabinet. Sa muli, maraming salamat. For purposes of the record, the hearing is hereby suspended. And again, maraming salamat po at magandang hapon sa inyong lahat.